Ghost Blusters, Book 5 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Chapter 1. Are you sure it wasn't an accident? I leant back in my chair and looked at the two detectives opposite me. I had met Detective Roy Prescott and Detective John Wilkinson only recently, after my mother hired an escort to show her the way to the Gold Coast in Queensland. My mother found the escort murdered in her bedroom, and I had to explain to the detectives that my mother thought an escort was a travel guide. I had hoped I would never see the detectives again, but now they were sitting in my office at Witchwood's Funeral Home, the business I had inherited from my father. Detective Wilkinson frowned at me. The perpetrator reversed over the victim several times after hitting her with the stolen car. Oh, there really was no suitable reply to that. And so that's why you have come to see me, because you think the murderer will come to the victim's funeral, I added. Both detectives nodded. I tapped my pen on the desk. I'm a little confused. This won't be the first time I've conducted a funeral for a murder victim, and police officers have been present every time. Wilkinson and Prescott exchanged glances. It's your mother, Wilkinson said. We have just been to see her. Prescott nodded. We explained that we would be attending the funeral and that we don't want anyone to be aware of the police presence. We want to be completely incognito. And my mother had a problem with that, I asked them. My mother was somewhat strange, and that's the understatement of the century, but I couldn't see why she would have a problem with the detectives being an anonymous presence at the funeral. Wilkinson rolled his eyes. To tell the truth, we don't know if your mother does have a problem. She wouldn't even listen to what we had to say, because she was so distressed about you doing the funeral for the victim. She told us that in no uncertain terms, Prescott added. He rubbed his temples hard with both hands. I sighed loudly. At first, my mother had been annoyed when I conducted themed funerals, such as a Kiss-themed funeral, a clown-themed funeral, and even an Elvis-themed funeral, but she had grown somewhat accustomed to them. In my mother's eyes, however, this funeral was far worse. It was a funeral for the lead singer of a punk rock band, a young woman by the name of Jezebel. That name alone had sent my mother into a headspin, but when she found out the name of the band was the Vengeful Harlots, she had ordered me not to take on the funeral. I'll call Pastor Green and ask him to have a word with her, I said. If anyone can control Mum, he can, and he's conducting Jezebel's service. The detectives thanked me and left. I returned to my desk and reached out my hand for my phone, intending to call Pastor Green, when Ernie materialized in front of me. I dropped my iPhone in shock, but was relieved to see that the screen didn't crack. You scared me, I said to Ernie. I'm a ghost, he said. We scare people. I narrowed my eyes at him. You don't scare anyone. He wagged his finger at me. But you just said I scared you. I don't know why you jump every time I appear. After all, I am the resident ghost. I sat on my office chair. Did you hear what the detectives said? Ernie nodded. I pushed on. Have you seen Jezebel's ghost yet? Ernie shook his head. No, sadly. She would be an interesting ghost too. Not like all those bland, boring ghosts that we've had lately. At least they crossed over quickly. I knew where he was going with this. Yes, and Jezebel won't cross over quickly because she was murdered. Hopefully the police will find her murderer soon so that she won't hang around here. Ernie fixed me with a glare. It's all right for you, Laurel. I've only got you and Basil to talk to. It gets awfully boring around here. I looked at the apparition appearing behind him. She was wearing an angry expression, plenty of tattoos and piercings, and the hair part of her mohawk was bright red and very high. "I don't think you're going to be bored for long, Ernie," I said. Chapter 2. Basil, my new boyfriend, and the funeral home's long-term accountant, was at the funeral for moral support. Goodness knows I was going to need it. I had worded up Pastor Green, and he had promised he would do the best he could with my mother. The one person in this whole affair who was happy was Janet, the funeral home's cosmetician. "I've never worked on such an interesting person," she said again and again. I hadn't seen Jezebel's ghost since her brief appearance in my office, and the funeral preparations had proceeded smoothly. "Where's your mother?" Ernie whispered in my ear. "I thought she'd be here by now, preaching hellfire and brimstone." I looked around to make sure nobody could see me speaking to what would look like thin air before I responded. "I'm in luck this time. She's very excited because she's been asked to sing at the annual church concert. It's going to be held directly after the funeral, so with any luck, she'll go straight to church and not come here." Ernie gestured to the door. "Your luck's just run out." Mum marched straight over to me and grabbed me by the arm. "Laurel, I've been so preoccupied with the church concert that I forgot to ask you. You won't be playing rock and roll music, will you?" I narrowed my eyes and thought that Mum looked a little out of place in her tweed skirt, thick pantyhose with sturdy, sensible, flat black shoes, and cashmere twinset and pearls. The crowd gathered so far were stereotypical rock musicians, so Mum stood out like a sore thumb. "The two band members are paying for Jezebel's funeral, so I'll play whatever they want me to play." I addressed her in the most firm tone I could muster. Mum gasped. "If you listen to rock music, you're going to have to be delivered from the demon of rock and roll." Ian, Mum's much younger church friend, appeared at Mum's shoulder and nodded vigorously. "Everyone here will need deliverance," he said through narrowed eyes. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. "I was delivered from the demon of rock music just before you were born, Laurel. Perhaps you need to be delivered too. That's where I went wrong with you." Ian was still nodding. "If you play rock music backwards, it's the devil speaking," he said sagely. I resisted the urge to slap him only with some difficulty. Just then the other two members of the Vengeful Harlots walked over to me. They were dressed pretty much as they had been at the booking consultation. Lottie Lovelace was wearing a huge, fluffy pink boa with purple baubles. She was wearing very little else, unless you counted the tight, low-rise black vinyl pants and the scanty black top. Delilah Devine wore a royal blue strapless dress so short that I hoped she wouldn't lean forwards, even slightly, along with black, slashed pantyhose and a hat perched at an angle on the top of her high-rise hairstyle. Their timing couldn't have been worse. They looked at Mum and Ian and then at me, so I realised I had no choice but to introduce them. "This is my mother Thelma and her friend Ian. Mum and Ian, this is Lottie Lovelace and Delilah Devine." Mum nearly passed out on the spot. "Delilah! Delilah!" she sputtered. "And she's certainly not divine. Blasphemy!" I looked around wildly for help from Pastor Green. I caught sight of him over by the music system, sadly about to start the music. I knew that would make matters even worse. Mum and Ian clutched each other as the music blared. "Such foul language," Mum said, releasing Ian to cover her ears with her hands. Lottie and Delilah appeared to be offended. "That song was 638 on the Australian music charts last year," Lottie said proudly. "It should have been 666, Ian said. Delilah looked at Ian and then Mum. "Aren't you too old for your little boyfriend?" Ian's jaw dropped open. The devil is a slanderer and a liar. I'll have you know I have a girlfriend, Audrey. Mum grabbed me by the elbow and dragged me into my office. They're harlots, all right, she screeched. I quickly shut the door behind her. Mum, shush. Someone will hear you. You can't say such things. They paid for the funeral, and I have to give them the same quality of service as anyone else. Ernie, who was sitting on the edge of my desk, raised his eyebrows. Mum was on a roll. Don't you tell me to shush, Laurel. Jezebel was a harlot, and Delilah was a harlot, and those two women have made themselves into harlots. And what's more, now one of them is dead, just like the real Jezebel. I crossed my arms and tried to think of something to say when Jezebel materialized right behind Mum. Who killed me? She asked loudly. I have to know who killed me. Ernie groaned. Here we go again. She's going to ask you to investigate her murder so she can cross over. Shush, you'll give her ideas, I said to Ernie. Mum, of course, thought I was talking to her. Don't you tell me to shush. If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times that's no way to speak to your betters. Jezebel's face lit up, as far as I could tell through the huge dark sunglasses. You can do that? If you find out who killed me, I'll find peace. Go to the other side. There is another side? I pointed to Ernie. Ernie has all the answers. I shot him a filthy look. My mother gasped. Laurel, you heard too much of that rock music, and it's affected your mind. You need to be delivered. Jezebel was evidently offended. What's her problem? That girl was a dreadful sinner, Mum said angrily. A dreadful, dreadful sinner. She wore marks on her body and piercings, just like all the devil worshippers do. And she called herself after that terrible sinner, Jezebel. Why, I bet she's possessed by a Jezebel spirit. Basil burst into the office at that point, clearly to protect me, although his timing was a little off. What's a Jezebel spirit? He made the mistake of asking. Men were created to be the bosses of women, Mum said. A man always has the authority over a woman. Women are to listen to their husbands and do what they tell them to do. A woman should never speak when a man is speaking. But, Basil began, but Mum interrupted him. Hush, I'm speaking, Basil. As I said, a woman should never speak when a man is speaking. Men are cleverer and stronger and more intelligent than women. A woman should always follow a man's lead. Ernie burst into a fit of laughter. Your mother's out of her tree, Laurel, he said through his chuckles. I failed to see the funny side of it, I said to Ernie. My mother alone could set feminism back 100 years. It's a wonder she thinks it's good that we got the vote. I don't think a married woman should vote, my mother said in a smug, sanctimonious voice. God has appointed man as head over the woman, so only the husband should vote. I closed my eyes and counted to 5 to try to calm myself, but Mum was still talking. And, Laurel, I can't believe you're doing a funeral for that nasty little strumpet and her ungodly friends. I shot another look at Jezebel and was at once concerned. She was shimmering strangely, and a deep red glow was emanating from her aura. I had never seen a ghost do that before. At first, I wondered if it was because she was a new ghost, but then I realized that my mother's words had driven her into a frenzy. My mother, the only one in the room who could not see Jezebel, continued on. Rock music is evil, I tell you, Laurel. I heard it when I was expecting you, and look how you turned out. Basil leapt to my defence. Mrs. Bay, I've told you not to insult Laurel. He probably would have said more, but he stopped talking to stare at Jezebel. She had doubled in size and appeared to be in the midst of an angry red whirlwind. That can't be good, Ernie said. I've never seen anything like it before. Mum kept talking. This Jezebel follows her father, Satan. I say Satan with a small s, as he doesn't deserve a capital S. I told you not to conduct a funeral for her, Laurel. And their band, the vengeful harlots, that shows what sort of unsavoury people they are. And her two friends, well, I have no words for them, but to say that they are greasy, grimy, gutter snipes, heading for an eternal damnation of their own devising. She continued her tirade, spewing forth insults. Basil put his arm around me as Jezebel's form grew bigger and bigger. Her form, still spinning, headed straight for Mum. I briefly wondered if a ghost could harm a living human, and then, all of a sudden, Jezebel vanished. "Where did she go?" Ernie asked me. "She must have been so upset that she vanished, the poor thing," I said. I shot a look at Mum, expecting her to berate me for talking to an empty space, but she didn't say anything. She staggered forward and grasped my desk. "Are you all right, Mrs. Bay?" Basil asked her. Mum reached out her hands and shook herself, and then turned around. She looked down at herself and then laughed. "On with the funeral," she said, and she marched out of the room. "Your mother's strange," Ernie said. I snorted rudely. "You're telling me? Quick, let's get after her. I don't want her insulting any of the mourners." Basil and I hurried after Mum, but to my enormous relief, for once she was not saying anything. I wondered why she was sitting in the front row, because she very well knew that we were to stay up the back and to remain inconspicuous throughout funerals. I saw Detectives Wilkinson and Prescott over the other side of the room. They, at least, were doing a good job of looking inconspicuous. I sure hoped Mum wouldn't cause any trouble. Just then, Lottie Lovelace and Delilah Devine walked over to sit in the same row as Mum. She jumped up and hugged each one in turn. They looked awfully surprised. "What's that all about?" Basil said in my ear. "Do you think she's taken some of her own advice and repented for her harsh words?" I shook my head. "Not a chance. She's up to something, only I don't know what it is." Much to my surprise, the funeral went off without a hitch. Ian sat up the back near us and muttered to himself the whole time, but considering that Pastor Green was conducting the funeral, Ian couldn't really do anything. Mum continued to sit in the front row, and I continued to watch her. When the funeral was over, Pastor Green announced that refreshments would be served in the anteroom. We always did that at funerals. I hurried in Mum's direction because I wanted to keep a close eye on her. When I reached Mum, I was dismayed to see she had enveloped a young man in a deep hug. He tried to get away and only managed to extricate himself with difficulty. "Mum, what's got into you?" I asked her. For some reason, she thought my comment very funny. "Harper Harris was my boyfriend," she said, sobering. "What do you mean?" I wondered if I hadn't heard her right. She smirked at me. "I mean he was Jezebel's boyfriend. He used to date Lottie Lovelace, but realized he liked Jezebel more." I was puzzled. "How did you know that, Mum?" Just then Pastor Green appeared at Mum's side. "Laurel, I'm afraid your mother and I have to take our leave. The church concert has already started. Will you be all right managing by yourself?" "Of course. That was a great service, as always, Pastor Green." He nodded his thanks and put his elbow under Mum's arm. "Come on, Thelma. It's almost time for you to sing your hymn at the concert." A look of surprise passed over Mum's face. "I'm singing at a concert?" I really was beginning to think something was wrong with Mum. "Yes? Did you forget? You're singing a hymn at the church concert." "Yes, Thelma," Pastor Green said. "You insisted on singing 'God Save Us Righteous Ones from Those Poor Wretched Sinners,' remember? You wrote the hymn yourself. If you don't hurry, you won't have a chance to sing it." I could tell the pastor was warring with himself, hoping Mum would be too late to sing the dreadful hymn she had written, but figuring it was his duty to let her proceed. I had heard her practicing it, and it was worse than any funeral dirge I had ever heard, and about 5 times slower and more mournful. Mum suddenly brightened up. "Sing? Yes, let's go." She turned to me. "You, what's your name again? Laurel? Fetch me some scissors. And where's that CD that was just playing?" Chapter 3. "Something's not right here," Ernie said, scratching his head. "I have to get back to work." Basil kissed me, which meant I lost all focus and concentration. I hurried back into the anteroom, but everything was fine. And why wouldn't it be? Towards the end of the funeral, I had slipped out to make sure everything was ready, filling all the urns for tea and coffee, and arranging the various assortments of cupcakes. I shook hands with Lottie Lovelace and Delilah Devine, both of whom said it had been a good service. I spotted Harper Harris standing over by the wall, all alone. I walked over to him. "I heard you were Jezebel's boyfriend," I said. "I'm sorry for your loss." He mumbled something and wiped his eyes. Ernie was frantically waving his arms to one side of Harper, so I excused myself and headed into the foyer. "Earth to Laurel, earth to Laurel," Ernie said, waving a hand in my face. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "What are you thinking?" I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Ernie pointed in the direction of the front door. "I think Jezebel has possessed your mother." "Possessed?" I shrieked, and then shot a look around the foyer. Luckily, everyone was in the anteroom. "You can't be serious." "I'm not entirely sure," Ernie said, floating a little above the tiled floor. "But the ghost was very angry, so angry that she didn't even notice me in the room, and then she did vanish into your mother, and then your mother started acting strangely." I clutched my stomach. Is that even possible? Can ghosts actually possess someone? And please land, you know how floating freaks me out. Ernie obliged. "I've been around here for some time, and I've never seen it happen, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. Laurel, think about it. If Jezebel possessed your mother, then she's on her way to sing at a church concert." I stood there, trying to take it all in. "Okay, let's say for a moment that Jezebel did possess Mum. Then what's the worst that could happen?" Ernie rolled his eyes dramatically. "Sometimes I wonder about you, Laurel. As much as I think it would be funny if your mother sings that hymn in punk rock fashion, I worry about how that will impact on you." I clutched my head. She did take scissors and the vengeful harlot's music with her. With that, I sprinted back to my office, grabbed my car keys, and shot out the front door. "What about the mourners?" Ernie called after me. I didn't have time to respond. While I wasn't entirely sure that a ghost could possess a person, I couldn't take any chances, and Mum had been acting very strangely. On the short distance to the church, I thought it over. If Jezebel had possessed Mum, then I didn't know how thorough that possession would be. Would it be sometimes Mum and sometimes Jezebel? I shook my head. The whole thing seemed entirely preposterous. But then again, some people didn't even believe in ghosts. I knew ghosts were real, so I supposed a ghost possessing someone wasn't so much of a stretch. Although the drive to the church was short, it seemed to take forever. In this small country town, one side of town was only about 15 minutes from the other. Victorian miners' cottages lined the highway. Some had been renovated beautifully, but others had not been painted in the 100+ years since their very first coat. These unkempt ones sat precariously on their old, leaning wooden stumps. Here and there were modern buildings, all concrete and glass, and standing on the sites where Victorian beauties had been sacrificed to make way for modernity. I parked the car and hurried inside the church. Music was already playing, and I looked around for Mum. I finally located her near the front of the church, and was surprised to see that she was wearing sunglasses. I made my way over to her, conscious of everyone turning to look at me. Mum's snooty friends sat next to her. On her other side was a man I hadn't met. He had a large camera and was scribbling in a notepad. Ian was on the other side of him. "Ian, could I please sit closer to Mum for a moment?" He frowned at me, but moved across one seat. The man sitting between us turned to look at me. "Hello, I'm Stephen Stonewall of the Good News Monthly." I must have looked blank because he supplied, "It's the most successful Christian magazine in New South Wales." I nodded. "I'm Laurel, Thelma's daughter." His face lit up. "Oh, you must be so proud of your mother. She's a veritable pillar of society. And to think she composed her very own hymn. What a wonderful woman. It was Thelma who invited me here to do a feature story on the church concert." I thought the magazine must be grasping at straws if they wanted to do a feature story on a small-town concert, but I had more pressing concerns. I had to find out as fast and as subtly as I could if Jezebel had possessed my mother. While I was silently debating what to do, one of Mum's friends, Martha, leant over to me. "It's about time you came here, Laurel. Your poor mother has such a hard time with things, and it will make her life easier if you become a good, church-going girl." Mum's other annoying friends, Francine and Doris, nodded in agreement. I leant across Stephen Stonewall and tapped Mum's arm. "What are you going to do, Mum?" Mum patted my knee. "Sing, Laurel, sing," she finished with a giggle. I broke into a cold sweat. The room swam and then receded a little, and I realized I was about to faint. I leant forward and put my head between my knees. I knew then that it wasn't Mum, because Mum would have responded to my question with an insult. Just then, a hand clamped hard on my back, and I heard someone muttering something over me. I sat upright and pushed Ian's hand off me. "What on earth are you doing, Ian?" Ian was visibly affronted. "I was laying hands on you and praying for you, Laurel." "Well, cut that out," I said. "Save your prayers for Mum." Another wave of dizziness hit me, so I put my head between my legs again. I just knew something terrible was about to happen. I was feeling so woozy that I didn't hear Mum called up to the stage. I looked up in time to see Mum handing someone the CD. Another wave of shock hit me because I saw that her tweed skirt had been shortened considerably and had slits all over it, and the skirt was held together with safety pins. Her skirt, I said in a small voice. Martha adjusted her glasses and looked at Mum's skirt. "You're right about your mother. She should have pulled her skirt down to cover her knees. It's most unseemly for a woman of her age to be showing her knees." Ian clearly took issue with the woman's words. "Poor Thelma's skirt ripped somehow, and she asked for safety pins to fix it," Ian said in a pious tone. "She is such a good, godly woman that she decided to go ahead with her hymn." I fought a manic desire to laugh. There was nothing I could do now but watch the scene unfold. Part of me wanted to run from the church, but part of me had a morbid fascination to see what would happen. Someone adjusted the microphone for Mum, but instead she walked over to the drums. She whispered in the drummer's ear, and he vacated his seat for Mum. Mum nodded to Pastor Green, who turned on her music. What followed after I have tried to forget many times, but I have never been able to put it from my mind. The music blared and reverberated all over the church walls. Mum ripped off her sunglasses and threw them down, and then launched into a screeching, raunchy song at the top of her lungs while beating the drums and gyrating. Ian gasped loudly beside me. "She's been possessed by the demon of rock music." "You don't know the half of it," I said. Ian rounded on me. "It's your fault, Laurel. There was rock music at the funeral service, and that opened the gateway for the devil." I didn't bother thinking up a suitable retort because I couldn't take my eyes off Mum, aka Jezebel. She really was going for it. Her cashmere cardigan followed the sunglasses onto the floor, and then she ripped off her pearls. The pearls bounced across the stage and then rolled down the aisle into the audience. I was surprised that Pastor Green didn't turn off the music, but he simply stood there, both hands clasped to his cheeks, his mouth wide open in a perfect imitation of Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. I heard Ian gasp, and I followed his gaze. There, to my right, were people dancing. "They're Methodists," Ian said by way of explanation. "They're Methodist youth. You don't see our youth behaving like that." He pointed to a group of young people sitting over to the left. Some of them were giggling, and the others looked shocked. I looked back at the people dancing to see an elderly man. He was getting right into it, busting some moves that would have put a young person to shame. He kept giving Mum the thumbs up. She was oblivious, of course, singing wildly and beating the drums. I stole a glance at Mum's snooty friends. One had either passed out or pretended to, because she was lying backwards in the seat, her eyes rolling in her head. Her two friends were too busy looking at Mum to notice. Stephen, from the Good News Weekly, was snapping photos as fast as he could. Just when I thought it would never end, Mum leapt from the drums and ran to the edge of the stage. I caught my breath, realizing she was about to do a stage dive. Mum flung herself into the air, but the Methodists apparently were not used to stage diving and all ran for it, clearly not wanting a middle-aged woman to fall on them. Mum landed face down on the church floor. Two of her friends raced over to her, as did Ian and some people I hadn't met. I hurried over too, thinking they were helping Mum, but it turned out they were trying to cast out the demon of rock music. "Out, foul demon!" Martha yelled. "You don't have permission to abide in this woman," Ian screamed at the top of his lungs. "I bind, evict, and dismiss you, you demon of rock music." I tried to pull Ian off Mum. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to deliver her, of course," he said over his shoulder. I was confused. "Where to? The hospital?" "Deliver her from the demon," Ian said. Stephen Stonewall bent over the group, taking photos and gasping at intervals. Pastor Green appeared at my side and managed to pull the people away from Mum, who was lying on the floor groaning. "I called an ambulance," he said to me. "Laurel, whatever has happened to your mother? Is she on medication?" "Yes, she is," I lied. "Strong medication," I added for good measure. I could hardly tell him that she was possessed by a punk rocker by the name of Jezebel. "Am I still dead?" Mum asked weakly. Pastor Green bent over her. "Thelma, I think you might be concussed. Do you remember what day the last women's prayer group was on?" Mum let out a string of language that made everyone gasp, and Stephen scribbled furiously in his notepad. "I've never met anyone who needed so much deliverance before," he said gleefully. "I've heard about it, but I've never seen it with my own eyes. I wonder if I can sell this story to 60 Minutes. The paramedics pushed everyone aside. Mum tried to sit up, but one of the paramedics restrained her. "Do you know what happened to you?" the male paramedic asked. "Someone hit me with a car, I think," Mum said. The male paramedic exchanged glances with the female paramedic before speaking. "What's your name?" Mum rubbed her forehead. "Jezebel." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, accompanied by murmurs of, "She needs deliverance from a Jezebel spirit." The female paramedic held up her hand. "How many fingers am I holding up?" "5, Mum said. She looked down at her clothes. "Oh, it's all coming back to me." "What's your age?" Mum sat up abruptly and glared at the paramedic. A change came over her demeanour. "How dare you ask me my age? How insolent! You should never ask a lady her age. And Laurel, why are you staring at me? Help me off the floor, you silly girl. Stephen Stonewall leant over and peered at Mum. She sure does need deliverance. She's really rude and cranky. Everyone shook their heads. No, she's back to normal now, the closest woman said to a murmur of agreement. We'll need to take you to hospital, the male paramedic said. Mum's face changed again. She lay back on one elbow and laughed. It's a bit too late for that. I've been dead for a few days. The paramedics wasted no time in placing Mum on a gurney and wheeling her out to the ambulance. I chased after them. I'm her daughter, I said. Would you like to ride with your mother? One of them asked me. I shook my head. No, I'll have to drive back afterwards, so I'll follow you in my car. The hospital was in the nearest town, 20 minutes away. It was a long, boring drive there, just highway and flat paddocks occasionally dotted with sheep. There were no nice trees to break the monotony, as most of the native trees in this part of the district suffered from dieback, a mysterious ailment that was variously attributed to beetles, pesticides, overgrazing, fertilizer, or clearing of the undergrowth. Whatever the reason, it left the Australian New England landscape dotted with bare, dead trees. Still, the drive afforded me plenty of time to think. Jezebel had possessed my mother, that was for sure and for certain. Even Jezebel's attempt at stage diving in my mother's body hadn't snapped her out of it, so to speak. What was I to do? What if Jezebel permanently possessed my mother? Was that even possible? I had no idea, and it was hardly something I could Google. Basil and I were the only ones I was aware of who could speak to ghosts. Even Ernie, a ghost himself, had no experience in this. What if Jezebel possessed my mother forever? And would that be a bad thing? Chapter 4. I found a parking spot easily enough outside the hospital, despite the fact that renovations were happening at the closest wing. It was a dull, yet imposing brick building made decades ago from the blue brick that abounded in the area. I made my way to the reception area, doing my best not to inhale the faint smell of hospital disinfectant, and inquired after my mother. The efficient nurse checked her computer and then made a call before answering. They're assigning your mother a room now. You can see her once she's in the room. Can't I see her now? I asked. The nurse shook her head and indicated a row of grey plastic seats against the bland, pale green wall behind me. Take a seat, and the doctor will speak to you presently. After half an hour, I was beginning to wonder about the nurse's definition of presently. I stood up, intending to ask her again, when a woman in a white coat briefly spoke to the nurse and then walked over to me. Thelma Bay? I nodded. I'm Dr. Stevenson. Is my mother all right? The doctor's eyes flickered for a moment, and then she said, I'd like to keep her in overnight for observation. Is your mother on any medication? Not as far as I know, I said. When I leave here, I can go to her house and look in her cupboards if you think I should. Yes, please do, and give me a call if you find anything, she said. We're not sure if your mother has concussion or not, but she said some rather strange things. Also, she doesn't know how old she is or what her name is. That's a cause for concern. I nodded. Can I see her now? Sure, she's in Wing 5, room 565. I thanked the doctor and followed the signs to Wing 5. Ernie materialized beside me, making me jump. I don't know why I always scare you, Laurel, he said. You should be used to me appearing by now. I shrugged off his words. Did you hear what the doctor said? Yes, I did, but I thought she might commit you too if I suddenly appeared and you took fright. Thanks, I said dryly. I really need to talk to Jezebel, or they'll keep my mother here forever. Ernie stopped in front of me.
That sounds like a good idea to me.
I was puzzled.
What is? The hospital keeping your mother here forever. You know, she's much more fun when she's possessed by Jezebel.
I laughed, but then a nurse came through one of the doors, so I kept walking. You're right, I said in a whisper when I thought no one could hear me. Mum had a private room with a view over the concrete parking area. I suppose it could have been worse. How are you feeling, Mum? I asked her. Mum was sitting up in bed, looking quite put out. I don't know how to break it to you, but I'm not your mother. I know, I said. I'm Laurel, and this is Ernie.
I'd shake your hand, but it would pass right through you,
Ernie said. Mum/Jezebel looked shocked.
You can see him?
I nodded. Yes, I can see ghosts. Why did you possess my mother?
It seemed like a good idea at the time, Jezebel said, but then added, she was such a mean old cow, insulting me and insulting my friends.
So what, you decided to possess her to get revenge?
Ernie said.
And don't take it personally. She's like that to everyone.
I actually didn't intend to possess her, Jezebel said. I got so angry. I got so angry that I didn't know what to do, and all my anger focused on her. The next thing I knew, I had possessed her.
So why didn't you unpossess her after you realized? I asked her.
I think the word should be dispossessed,
Ernie said thoughtfully. Jezebel shrugged.
I wasn't even sure how I did it, but I thought it would be a good idea to keep possessing her, because then I would be able to find out who killed me.
I thought about it for a moment. Yes, that makes sense. When you find out who murdered you, then you can cross over, and you'll stop possessing my mother at that point. Ernie nodded in agreement.
If you don't want Jezebel to stay in your mother forever, then you'll have to help her find out who murdered her. Think carefully before you decide, Laurel. Remember what your mother's like.
I had to admit he had a point, but I really couldn't, in all good conscience, leave Jezebel possessing my mother forever. The police will surely solve your murder soon. Jezebel propped herself up further in the hospital bed and rearranged her pillows.
I have no confidence in the police. I have inside information they don't have.
Like what? I asked her.
I don't mean anything specific as such, she said, but I know the suspects better than the police do. Laurel, will you investigate my murder?
I was still confident the detectives would solve it, but I had no choice but to agree. Sure, I'll make notes. Jezebel held up a hand.
First of all, tell me your mother's name, date of birth and address, and anything else pertinent you can think of. If I don't tell them all that the next time they ask me, they might put me in a psychiatric ward.
Ernie nodded.
Good idea.
I gave Jezebel the information and then drilled her a few times. That's good, I said. Should I write it down somewhere so you can remember? Jezebel shook her head.
There's nothing to write on here, and even if I did make notes, it wouldn't look good for me if one of the nurses found it.
I agreed. Okay then, let's get to the matter of your murder, if it won't upset you. She shook her head.
It's a bit too late for that.
What do you remember? Jezebel didn't have a chance to answer because Pastor Green hurried into the room. He walked over to sit on the bed and patted Jezebel's hand.
Thelma, my dear, you gave us all a fright.
Act very religious, Ernie said urgently. Thelma's very religious. You don't want the pastor to think you're nuts and tell the doctor.
Jezebel did what I assume was an imitation of looking pious and crossed herself.
I'll say 3 Hail Marys for giving you a fright, Father, she said in a monotone.
I forced a laugh. Ha ha, Mum. Stop teasing Pastor Green. You know he's not Catholic. Jezebel looked surprised.
Isn't everyone Catholic? I thought God was Catholic.
Pastor Green turned to me, worry etched all over his face.
Oh dear, Laurel. Her mind is still affected. Should I go fetch the doctor? No, no, I said. She remembers her name and address, even her age now. She's improving. The doctor said she needs a lot of rest. Pastor Green took the hint and stood up. Call me if you need anything, Laurel. Before I could say anything, Jezebel spoke. Are you married? I mean, all my memories came back, but I can't remember if you're married. Pastor Green's eyes widened. No. Jezebel smiled, looking like a spider about to jump on its prey. You're quite cute, aren't you? I took the pastor by the elbow and led him from the room. I'm sure she'll be all right by morning, I said in the most convincing tone I could muster. When I was back in the room, I addressed Jezebel. You have to be more careful, Jezebel. My mother would never flirt with anyone. Jezebel looked like she couldn't care less, so I added, Now, where were we? You asked her if she remembered anything about being murdered, Ernie supplied. Jezebel chewed one of Mum's fingernails. Lottie, Delilah and I were out clubbing. I felt sick, so one of them suggested I get some air. I interrupted her. Which one suggested that? Jezebel shrugged. Can't remember. Did they suggest you go into the alley behind the club? I pressed her. She shook her head again. Not sure. I don't think so. Maybe? Were you drinking a lot? Ernie asked her. Jezebel bit her lip and thought for a while before answering. No more than usual, and it's never made me sick before. Was your boyfriend there too? I asked. No, it was a girls' night out. Besides, it would be too awkward because Lottie used to date him. Okay, tell me everything you can remember, I said. Jezebel put her head in her hands. It was horrible. I was in the alleyway and a car came straight at me. It all seemed to happen in slow motion, like a dream. I couldn't move my muscles. They were like jelly. It hit me, and then I remember it kept reversing over me. Ernie shuddered. Ouch. I think I was already in ghost form halfway through it, so it didn't hurt, Jezebel said. And then someone got out of the car and looked at me, and then drove off really fast. Do you remember if it was a male or a female? I asked her. No idea, and before you ask me, I don't even know what colour the car was or what sort of car. That's not a lot to go on, Ernie said. I shot him a look of agreement and then turned back to Jezebel. Can you think of anyone with a reason to kill you? Before she could respond, I added, You said you had inside information. Lottie probably thinks I stole Harper from her, because I did. She resents me for that, maybe as I stole her last few boyfriends. We have, like, a contest, you see. I didn't really see, but I nodded anyway. Jezebel was still talking. Anyway, I'm sure she didn't want me dead. And there's my boyfriend. I didn't quite trust him. He has a gambling problem, so he borrowed a lot of money from me. I mean, a lot. I was pressuring him to start paying it back, and he didn't like that. They're both motives, I suppose, Ernie said, but surely it had to be someone with a stronger motive than that. I was getting to that, Jezebel said, pursing her lips. I'm a website designer, and some of my clients might want me out of the way. I raised my eyebrows. Because you designed their websites badly? Jezebel made a rude snorting sound. Of course not. I'm a hacker. I mean, I was a hacker. Sure, I was a website designer, but I was also a hacker. Several people paid me to do work for them. There was Phil Palmer, who paid me to falsify hospital records. She tapped her chin. There was a woman, Daisy Fairchild, who wanted me to transfer money from her husband's bank account into hers. There were other clients too, but those were the most recent ones. I looked up from making notes on my phone. Was much money involved? Jezebel nodded. It was $750,000 from Daisy's husband's bank account, and then her husband found out and wanted to pay me more to transfer it back. And did you? Ernie and I said in unison.
Jezebel said a few rude words.
Of course not. I do have professional standards. If word got out that I double-crossed a client, I wouldn't get any more clients. Oh, I forgot to mention that Delilah didn't want me in the band. She said I was too wild. Delilah always said that punk rock was a voice for feminism, that it was about so much more than music. She said it was radical. In fact, she said a lot of stuff, and she always said that I only cared about the music.
Hang on a minute, I said. Back to the matter of this Daisy woman. Why didn't her husband simply go to the police?
There was no proof, of course. Daisy was a trophy wife, a good 20 years younger than her husband. He used to transfer large amounts, granted not that large, into her account, but now he has a mistress and he's been transferring small amounts into her account. He used to give Daisy expensive gifts, so it would simply look to the police like he was guilty and putting money into her account.
That sounded strange to me. But surely they'd have a prenup.
Yes, and that was the problem. Daisy stands to get a lot of money if they divorce. I explained that to him and said he should just let the money go. Anyway, he got really angry and threatened me.
What's his name?
Donny Fairchild.
I typed his name into my phone notes. Okay then, back to Delilah. You said she wanted you to leave the band. Jezebel nodded. Enough to kill you? I asked.
Jezebel shrugged. I would have said no, but then again, I'm dead. Somebody did it.
Chapter 5. The following morning I was sitting in my office, staring out the window at Basil's 2 pet sheep, Arthur and Martha. Basil had to go to Tamworth for business the previous night. I was looking forward to some quiet time to myself to get on top of the mounting pile of paperwork before dealing with Jezebel's murder and with the fact that she had possessed my mother. The alarm at the front door sounded. I sighed and got to my feet. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked out in the foyer, and to my dismay I saw Ian and Mum's snooty friends. "We're here to see how Thelma is," Ian said. "We knocked on her door, but there was no answer." The others simply looked at me with disgust. "I think they're releasing her from the hospital soon," I said to Ian, but he shook his head. "No, I called, and they said she was released first thing this morning." For some reason, a cold chill covered my whole body as goosebumps broke out all over me. Why did I have a sudden premonition? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. Jezebel, in Mum's body, burst through the door. Even I didn't recognize her for a moment. She had shaved off her eyebrows and had drawn them in black lines at a strange angle. Her lipstick was bright red and her sunglasses huge and dark. I have no idea why I noticed that first, because she had shaved the sides of her head and must have used a lot of product, because the remaining hair of her new mohawk hairdo, did I mention it was fire engine red, pointed skyward in a bizarre, wedge-like design. There was a loud thud behind me. I looked around to see that Ian had fainted. Mum's friends ignored him and stood there staring at Jezebel, their jaws hanging open in shock. I walked over to Ian and patted his face. "Ian?" There was no response, so I went to my office to fetch a bottle of water. This was a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. Why would Jezebel do such a thing? I had promised to help solve her murder. I could only assume it was payback for the horrible things Mum had said about her and her band. When I returned, Ian was still out cold, so I poured a little water on his face. He rallied and sat up, but clutched both his cheeks when he saw Jezebel again. "Come and sit in the chapel," I said. Jezebel bounced over to him.
"Come on, Ian. You look like you've seen a ghost."
The whole time, Mum's friends remained speechless. Jezebel and I took Ian into the chapel and sat him on the closest chair. "You have a lot of explaining to do," I whispered to Jezebel. one of Mum's friends finally spoke.
"Whatever's got into you, Thelma? Clearly you're having some sort of mental breakdown."
Jezebel flung her arms skyward.
I'm free from the oppression of religion."
Mum's friends gasped and clutched each other. Martha recovered first. She marched over to Jezebel and shook her finger in her face.
"I don't know if this is some sort of middle-age crisis, but it is of the devil. Get a grip on yourself, Thelma, and stop acting like a bratty teenager. You should be ashamed of yourself." "Don't speak to me like that, you old hag," Jezebel said angrily. "You're dried-up old prunes, all of you. You're just jealous because I'm attractive and you're not."
"Jezebel!" I exclaimed in shock, and then added hastily, "Mum?"
"You got it right the first time, Laurel," Francine said. "Your mother needs deliverance from a Jezebel spirit. Come on, ladies, let's all deliver her from this Jezebel spirit."
Jezebel backed away from them.
"Don't touch me! Deliver this!"
With that, she began giving Ian a lap dance. He passed out once more, but that didn't stop Jezebel. She gyrated rather too close to Ian, leaving Mum's 3 friends horror-stricken. After I averted my eyes at her choice of underwear, I took her arm and did my best to pull her off him. "Jezebel, this wasn't our deal." Martha came up behind me. "I misjudged you, Laurel," she said. "I didn't know you attended another church. A shame your mother never informed us. You clearly recognize that your poor mother needs deliverance from a very strong Jezebel spirit." Francine readily agreed.
"A strong man spirit," she said. "It's the head Jezebel spirit, and there are many other spirits attached to it."
Doris nodded vigorously.
"Yes, there's the demon of exhibitionism, the demon of bad temper, the demon of bad dress sense, the demon of mutton dressed as lamb."
She droned on and on, naming all sorts of demons, leaving me to wonder whether she had a good sense of humor or whether she was, in fact, serious. After a while, I realized it was the latter. Averting their eyes from Jezebel, who was still giving Ian a lap dance, the 3 ladies formed a huddle. "I wonder what let it in," Martha said.
"Perhaps Thelma watched a horror movie,"
Doris said thoughtfully. Francine shook her head.
"There was a documentary on ancient Egyptian history," she said. "It was on the night before last. Perhaps Thelma watched that with all those pagan gods in it."
Martha and Doris nodded sagely.
"That would do it,"
Doris said. I looked back at Jezebel to see she was removing her clothes. I ran over to her and grabbed her arm, pulling her off Ian.
"Perhaps you ladies should take Ian away and pray for him,"
I said, figuring that would do the trick. "I need to have a stern word with my mother."
"Good idea, Laurel."
Francine nodded in approval. Doris patted Ian's cheeks until he revived, although he nearly fainted again when he caught sight of Jezebel. The ladies hurried him out, praying for him all the way. I dragged a protesting Jezebel into my office and locked the door behind us. I pointed to one of the office chairs. "Sit." Jezebel shot me a petulant look, but did as she was told.
"This was hardly part of our deal,"
I said in a stern tone, gesturing up and down her. She opened her eyes wide.
"What do you mean?"
"Don't play innocent with me," I said, annoyed.
"You very well know that when you leave my mother's body and cross over, she will be left with your hairstyle. That's hardly fair."
As an afterthought, I said, "At least you didn't get a tattoo." Jezebel shifted uneasily in her seat.
"You got a tattoo, didn't you?"
"Only one," she said, crossing her arms. I gasped. "You didn't. Where is it?"
"Somewhere only your mother will see,"
she said with a giggle. I walked behind my desk, sat in my chair, and put my head in my hands. "Tell me you're not serious."
"I'm not serious."
I brightened up. "Really?" She smirked at me.
"No,
I got a tattoo. It was only one, though.
I was angry now. I thought about asking her what it was, but thought that would only stress me even more.
Look here, I agreed to help you, and now you've left a tattoo on my mother. Surely you know she thinks tattoos are of the devil.
Jezebel was still smirking.
Yes, which is precisely why I did it.
I stood up and folded my arms.
Now see here, Jezebel, if I'm to find out who murdered you, then you have to act and dress like my mother.
She made to protest, but I held up my hand.
Deal?
Jezebel frowned at me. At least I thought she did behind those huge sunglasses.
You know, I don't need your help. I could investigate by myself.
I waved one hand at her.
Sure, go ahead.
But I'll have you know that my best friend Tara is a witch, and so is my boyfriend Basil. I'm sure they know a way to get you out of my mother. I was lying, of course, but she didn't know that. It seemed to do the trick.
Okay, we have a deal.
I waved my finger at her.
Not so fast. We have to set boundaries. You're treating me like a child.
Jezebel shot me a petulant look.
Well, if you act like a child, then you'll be treated like a child.
I groaned and sat back in my seat. Horrors, I'm turning into my mother. To Jezebel, I said, "These are the boundaries. I will do my very best to find out who murdered you as soon as possible, and you do your very best to act exactly like my mother. You have to wear her clothes and speak like she does and generally act like her." Jezebel looked quite put out.
Okay, she finally said. On the other hand, it might be nice to stay in your mother just for fun.
I was about to say something when she shook her head.
No, it's weird being in your mother. I keep feeling all her disapproval, and I can almost hear her lecturing me. It's quite horrible, actually. Okay, I'll do my best.
I was hugely relieved. I'll take you over to her house now and find you some clothes. I don't know what to do about your hair.
The red is only a spray-on colour, she offered happily. It will wash out.
Well, the style won't wash out, will it? I said, irritated. You'll have to wear one of her hats. Jezebel shuddered. And don't go to her church or speak to any of her friends, and don't answer the door to anyone. I unlocked the office door and beckoned for Jezebel to follow me. Keep a low profile.
I'll be awfully bored,
I thought for a moment. My mother did have Foxtel, but it was only the Christian channel. You can watch Netflix all day and eat. That should be relaxing. Jezebel let out a string of foul language. I turned to her. My mother doesn't swear, and you just agreed to act like my mother.
Oh dear, I am so dreadfully sorry,
she said in a good imitation of my mother's pious tone, so much so that I had to laugh. That's good. We had reached Mum's house, and I unlocked the door. Don't answer her phone, no matter what. And don't call any of your friends, as they know you're dead. It won't be so boring, because I'll check back in and tell you all the information I've found out. Now, let's get you some horrible clothes. An hour later, I had managed to wrangle Jezebel into a black skirt, sensible black shoes, and a long-sleeved white shirt. Jezebel had washed the red out of her hair, and I had forced her to wear one of Mum's hats.
I don't have to wear her perfume, do I?
Jezebel asked in horror. Of course not. Not if you don't want to, I said. But I don't think her perfume is all that bad. You don't like the scent?
It's the names.
Jezebel held out a bottle. I read the label. Sobriety. I assumed that one's alcohol-free. I laughed at my own joke. I had never looked at Mum's perfume bottles before. Where would she even buy perfume like this? I looked at the other perfume labels. Charity, piety, patience, chastity. I was sitting on Mum's bed, waiting for Jezebel to check out her look in the bathroom mirror, when I heard a blood-curdling scream. Chapter 6. I ran to the bathroom and flung open the door. "What happened?" Jezebel, speechless, pointed to the mirror. I couldn't see the problem, so I asked again, "What happened?"
"I look terrible,"
she said in an anguished tone. I had to agree. "But that's the look we're going for," I said. "Now let's go downstairs and we'll talk about the suspects." Just then my text tone sounded. It was Basil. "Where are you?" I texted back, "At Mum's." I waited for a text back, but there wasn't one, although someone rang the front doorbell. "I think it's Basil," I said to Jezebel. "Sit in the living room, and if it's anyone other than Basil, try to act like my mother. Better still, try not to speak at all." It felt strange being in my mother's house when she was not around. Of course, her body was around, but with Jezebel, the whole place took on a different vibe. I opened the door to see it was Basil. He held 2 cups of coffee, and there was a brown bag squeezed underneath his arm. "Sustenance," he announced, holding up the polystyrene cups. "I thought you might need this." I closed the door behind me. "Let's go around the back," I told him, "and sit in the garden. I need a break from you-know-who." "The rock star who possessed your mother?" "That's the one." We went around back. I sat on the warm stone bench while Basil stirred sugar into my coffee. It was pleasant just to sit here next to him, watching the sunlight catch the gold in his hair. I almost wanted to reach out and tug on a strand, but I didn't know if that would be weird. We hadn't been together too long, and I didn't know what to do with my hands when Basil was around. Thank goodness I could nurse the coffee. I took a bite of the bagel. "So what brings you here?" I asked. "Just checking in," he replied. "I'm here for moral support." He set his coffee down beside us, and then he placed an arm around my shoulder. He smelt amazing, like clean laundry, but he also had that natural basil scent that made me want to curl my toes and scrunch up my nose. I leant into his shoulder and sighed. I wanted to kiss him then, only I didn't know how. I pressed my fingers into the warmth of his chest, and we leant on each other, our heads together. "Thank you for stopping by," I whispered. "Of course," he whispered back. He cupped my face with his large hands and pressed his lips to mine. When we kissed, my stomach exploded with butterflies. I sat back and took a sip of my coffee, my cheeks burning. We'd kissed before, of course, but I wasn't expecting how girlish I would feel when Basil kissed me in the warm light of day. I pulled away from Basil when someone cleared their throat loudly. I turned around to see Jezebel looking at me. "For a moment, I forgot you were here," I said to her. Jezebel let out a grunt of disapproval.
"I figured that. You know, I'm feeling quite sad now."
"Because you're dead?" I asked her. It was probably not the most tactful thing to say, but then again, there was no getting around the fact. She shook her head.
"No, because I just realized I'd never kiss anyone again."
She looked Basil up and down and then added,
"Unless, of course, you'd like to lend me your boyfriend for a moment."
Basil stood behind me. "Ooh." "Keep your hands off him," I said. "Anyway, who knows what happens on the other side? There could be lots of kissing." Jezebel appeared to be thinking over my words. I turned to Basil. "You missed out on a lot of fun. Jezebel here discharged herself from the hospital and then bought some interesting and quite scant clothing and got a haircut." With that, Jezebel pulled off her hat and Basil gasped. "It was bright red before and standing up high," I told him. "This is an improvement, believe me. And that's not all. Mum's stuck-up friends came around with Ian and—" Basil interrupted me. "Did they see her like that?" "They sure did. And she gave Ian a lap dance." "You're kidding." I made a face. "No, sad to say. Anyway, let's go back inside and get to work solving this case. The sooner we solve the case, the sooner Jezebel stops possessing my mother, and we will have Mum back." Basil did not appear the least encouraged by my words. "It's sort of a choice between two evils, isn't it?" he said. I grimaced and held the door open for them. So true. Anyway, I'll get some pen and paper and we can make some notes. I'll order pizza. Jezebel, what sort of pizza would you like? Soon the three of us were sitting around Mum's dining table eating pizza, the heavenly aroma wafting through the room. I took a large bite and then looked at the list in front of me. So the lesser suspects are Lottie, Delilah, and Harper. Your hacker clients are Daisy Fairchild, her husband Donnie, and Phil Palmer. Well, Donnie was a wannabe client, but you know what I mean. Basil stroked his chin. Don't write off Harper Harris so easily. Gambling is a serious problem. I'm sure people have been murdered over less. I expected Jezebel to jump to his defense, but she didn't. He did owe me over $200,000. I gasped. I didn't realize it was so much. Basil ate another slice of pizza before speaking. My money's on this Harper guy. I think we need to look into him first, Laurel. How was your relationship with your boyfriend? I asked Jezebel. She shrugged. Well, he wasn't the love of my life or anything like that. We were just having a good time. You know what I mean? But surely your relationship was solid. After all, you lent him so much money, I pointed out. She shrugged again. Yes, we did have a solid relationship, but I didn't expect it to be one that would last forever. I was a little confused by that, but let it go. Can you think of anyone else? Anyone at all? Think hard before answering. Is there anyone else you can think of who might have wanted to kill you? Surely you had other hacker clients. Jezebel took some time before answering. I can't think of anyone else at all. The other hacker clients I had were mostly people who wanted me to fake their resumes. You know, hack into a database and add that they'd worked for some big firm. And then there were some people who wanted me to hack into their academic record at a university and make it better. That type of thing. Maybe we should make a list of all these people and go through them one by one, Basil said. I tapped my chin. I'm not so sure. Were any of these recent, Jezebel? She shook her head. The only two clients I've had anything to do with recently are Phil Palmer and Daisy Fairchild. Then I agree with you, Laurel, Basil said. The easier solution is usually the correct one. We'll need to speak to the other members of the band and Jezebel's boyfriend, as well as these two clients. Good idea. I remembered my phone conversation with my best friend Tara that morning. Her husband, Duncan, was a police sergeant in town. I forgot to tell you, Duncan told Tara that the police haven't made any headway. They're focusing on the boyfriend and the band members. But if it's one of the hacker clients, how will the police find out about them? Jezebel asked, clearly agitated. We can make an anonymous phone call, Basil said, and then... Basil was interrupted by the sound of the front doorbell. We exchanged glances. Basil crossed to the window to peek around the curtains. It's Pastor Green, he said in horror. Let's pretend no one's home, I said hopefully. Basil shook his head. My car's parked out front. He'll know I'm here. Jezebel, act just like my mum, I said urgently. Act very polite and very religious. I don't know how to act religious, Jezebel said. Did you ever go to Sunday school when you were young? I asked her in despair. She nodded. Yes, when I was 5 or so. Don't you remember anything from Sunday school, anything at all? Her eyes narrowed. Not really. I can't remember much about it at all. I only remember those little songs we used to sing. Basil nodded and walked towards the front door. Just go with that, I said urgently. Basil showed Pastor Green into the living room, and he made a beeline for Jezebel. Thelma, how are you doing? He asked with concern. Jezebel shrugged, and I gave her a look of approval. Goodness gracious me, Thelma. Did they have to shave your head? Jezebel nodded. Yes,
just to make sure she didn't have concussion, but she doesn't," I said. Thankfully, he didn't appear to know that I was lying.
"Thelma, have they changed your medication? Did they find out what was wrong? Everyone in the church is praying for you."
"Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world," Jezebel said nervously.
Pastor Green shot an anxious look at me over his shoulder. He turned back to Jezebel. "Quite so, quite so. Are you sure you're all right?" Jezebel nodded.
"This train don't carry no liars. Truth is what the Lord desires."
I sighed inwardly. I didn't want Jezebel to recite classic Sunday school songs. I just wanted her to use them for inspiration. Maybe I should have pointed that out. "Is something wrong with your eyes?" Pastor Green asked Jezebel. It was then I noticed she was still wearing the huge sunglasses. I had become so used to them that I hadn't asked her to take them off.
"Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see," Jezebel said. "There's a Father up above, and he's looking down in love, so be careful, little eyes, what you see."
"Mum's not quite herself yet," I said, and that was the truth. "It's going to take some time." I debated whether I should offer Pastor Green some coffee. That would have been the usual thing to do, but I wanted to get him away from Jezebel as soon as possible. Pastor Green's worried expression had not left his face. "I had better go, but please call me if you need any help, Laurel. I'm going back to prepare my sermon on Zacchaeus."
"Zacchaeus was a wee little man," Jezebel piped up, "and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see."
I hurried to the pastor's side and took him by the arm. "Thanks so much for coming to visit, Mum," I said. "I'd love you to stay for coffee and cake, but I'm trying to keep her quiet." He patted my shoulder and looked down at me sadly. "I understand." I opened the door and shut it behind him the nanosecond he passed through. I locked and bolted it and hurried back into the living room.
"I didn't say to recite Sunday school songs," I said crossly.
Jezebel looked affronted, but I didn't know whether her manner was genuine or not.
"I was doing my best," she said in a plaintive tone.
I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I turned to Basil. "Who should we investigate first? Do you still want to investigate Harper Harris?" Just then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Tara.
"Laurel, I thought you'd like to know. Lottie Lovelace has just been charged with assault on Harper Harris."
Chapter 7. I relayed Tara's words to Basil and Jezebel. "I'm meeting Tara at a coffee shop now to get the lowdown on the assault arrest." Basil looked at his watch. "I'd go with you, but I'm currently arranging tax office audit insurance for all my clients, so I'm pressed for time." I shot a look at Jezebel. "Will you be all right staying by yourself? Promise me you won't leave the house." Basil shot me a worried look. "You really can't leave Jezebel here alone. You'll have to take her with you." Jezebel's face brightened considerably.
"Please take me with you," she pleaded. "I promise to act like your mother in front of your friend. I'll do my best."
I bit my lip and thought it over. "Okay, I suppose it's safer to take you with me, but you have to promise to be on your best behavior." Jezebel nodded vigorously. "Anyway, Tara already knows that you possessed my mother," I added. Jezebel's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't respond. I drove to the small, dark cafe in the middle of town. Tara liked Alexicus, but I didn't. Their coffee was way too strong for me, and while their after-6 menu, such as pizza, was great, their daytime menu left a lot to be desired, unless you liked toasted tomato and cheese sandwiches, which I didn't.
"I know you think the coffee is too strong here," Tara said by way of greeting.
She was sitting in a booth to the far left of the cafe with a view through the huge window over the highway. A cattle truck roared past, and drowned out my reply. "I'm a half-shot type of coffee person," I said after a pause, "and I don't like bitter coffee."
"What does it matter anyway?" Tara said. "Don't you drink decaf now?"
I nodded. After my 2 coffees to wake up, I try to drink decaf for the rest of the day. Anyway, decaf still has to taste nice, and it doesn't taste nice if it's too strong. I took a seat opposite her and gestured for Jezebel to sit down. Tara leant across the table and stared at Jezebel. I could see she was doing her best not to laugh.
"Nice to meet you, Jezebel. I've never met anyone who was possessed before."
She shot me a worried look and then asked,
"Will your mother remember any of this when Jezebel leaves her?"
I smacked myself on my forehead. Hell's bells, I hadn't thought of that. I'd better watch what I say from now on. Tara laughed. "Don't get into the habit of saying hell's bells, because you know how Thelma will react to that." Jezebel spoke for the first time since arriving at the cafe.
"Your mother seems like a load of fun, Laurel."
Tara laughed.
"Trust me, she is. If it's any consolation, I don't know if she will remember everything, although I can feel her disapproval most of the time."
She thought for a minute and then amended that to
"all the time, to tell you the truth."
"When Mum previously came out, did she put up some sort of fight against you?" I asked her. Jezebel looked puzzled.
"What do you mean?"
"I mean, when you see someone possessed on TV, the person that has been possessed will sometimes try to come out." Jezebel shook her head.
"No, I haven't felt anything like that."
The waiter came over to take our orders. I noticed that Jezebel was eyeing him greedily, so I kicked her under the table. She let out a string of swear words that made me blush.
"Language?"
I said. Jezebel looked embarrassed.
"Sorry."
I quickly ordered air-dried potato chips and a half-shot caramel decaf latte on almond milk. Jezebel ordered a double-shot espresso and 3 toasted cheese and tomato sandwiches, and Tara ordered a mochaccino and 1 cheese and tomato toastie. After the waiter beat a hasty retreat, Jezebel apologized again.
"Sorry, but he's super cute."
I eyed the retreating waiter appraisingly. "He is, but you have to act like Mum. Mum doesn't check out hot young guys, not as far as I know, anyway." I laughed at the thought. "Now, Tara, what did you find out from Duncan?" Tara leant back in her seat and then looked around the room to see if anyone was listening. No one was sitting close to us, so she pressed on.
"Lottie Lovelace said Harper Harris told her that he would go back to her if it wasn't for Jezebel. He said Jezebel was all that was standing in the way of him going back to Lottie."
I interrupted her. "That doesn't make any sense. He left Lottie for Jezebel." Jezebel agreed loudly, so I shot her a withering look.
"Okay, I worded that badly," Tara said. "What I meant was that Lottie fully expected Harper to resume their relationship now that Jezebel is dead."
She shot a look at Jezebel.
"Sorry about that."
Jezebel shrugged.
"Okay, I'm still not explaining well. Apparently before Jezebel died, Lottie spoke to Harper, and he said he wanted to go back to her, only he was afraid of Jezebel."
"What a load of nonsense," Jezebel said angrily, drawing a look from the patrons on the other side of the room. I was beginning to think it was a bad idea bringing her, and I told her so. "Jezebel, please keep your voice down. You're probably going to hear things that you don't want to hear, especially given the fact that you were murdered." Jezebel narrowed her eyes but didn't say anything. Tara leant forward once more.
"Obviously that was just a story Harper told Lottie to let her down gently, I suppose. After Jezebel died, Lottie went to see Harper again, and he said he didn't want a relationship with her. When she pointed out to him that he'd previously said he was afraid of Jezebel, and that Jezebel was all that was standing in his way of resuming a relationship with her, then he told her how he really felt. He must have been angry, because he also accused her of murdering Jezebel. That's when she punched him.
Wow. I would have said more, but our drinks arrived. I looked at my latte with dismay. It was so strong that I wondered if I would be able to drink it. When the waiter left, I asked Tara, "Did Duncan say whether the police think Harper Harris really believed that Lottie murdered Jezebel, or was he saying it in the heat of the moment?" Tara sipped her coffee before answering.
"That's not all. Harper told the police that he thinks Lottie murdered Jezebel because she's an insane stalker."
"Do you mean Lottie's an insane stalker?" I asked her. "Lottie or Jezebel?" I turned to Jezebel. "No offense."
"Lottie, of course," Tara said. "Well, I don't know if she is, but that's what Harper told the police. He said that ever since Jezebel died, she's been texting him non-stop and calling him and so on. He blocked her number, but then she used a friend's phone to call him. He had to block her from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram because she sent him heaps of inboxes as well as public comments. He said she's relentless."
Our food had arrived. I was quite partial to air-fried potato chips. They weren't soaking in oil, yet they had delicious, crispy edges and were nicely covered with salt. In short, they were delicious. It didn't take Jezebel long to eat her 3 toasted sandwiches.
"Does food taste completely normal to you?" I asked her, "given that you're a ghost?" "You know, I hadn't even thought about that," Jezebel said. "Everything seems completely normal. I don't feel any different being dead, not at all. Of course, I felt different when I was in ghost form, but now that I'm in your mother, I feel quite normal."
I was sorely tempted to say something, but thought I should hold my tongue in case my mother remembered what happened to her when she was possessed. "Well, I suppose we should return to the matter at large. Jezebel, do you think Lottie could be the murderer? Or could Harper simply be covering up for murdering you so he didn't have to pay you back that money?" Jezebel shook her head and stared into space.
"Keep this to yourselves," Tara said, "but the police are now closely looking at Lottie, or possibly Harper, as the murderer."
"That's great news," I exclaimed. "Now the police will be able to solve your murder, Jezebel." Jezebel shook her head.
"No, neither of them could be the murderer."
"Yes, I know you don't want to believe that," I said, "but—" She interrupted me.
"No, I'm sure it can't be Lottie or Harper. I know Lottie is unhinged, and she was probably a bit cross that I stole her boyfriend, but I'm sure she didn't murder me."
I raised my eyebrows when Jezebel said, "a bit cross." She was more than a bit cross, Jezebel. She's stalking this Harper guy, and she seems to have gone into a jealous rage. Surely someone like that could murder someone. Can't you at least admit the possibility?" Jezebel shook her head firmly.
"No, I don't think it's her, or Harper for that matter."
I caught Tara's eye and shook my head slightly. "So who do you think murdered you in that case?" I asked Jezebel. Jezebel bit her lip.
"I think you need to investigate Phil Palmer and Daisy and Donnie Fairchild. There was more money involved there."
"Murders aren't always about money," I pointed out. Jezebel burped loudly.
"Maybe so, but surely you can see the need to investigate them."
"I can see the need for the police to investigate them," I said. "We need to make that anonymous phone call to the police. Right now, the police don't know about Phil Palmer or Daisy and Donnie Fairchild. Not as far as we know, anyway." I raised my eyebrows at Tara. She shook her head.
"Duncan didn't mention them at all."
"Okay then, that settles it. We need to call the police and tell them about the 3 of them, and then we can leave it to the police to investigate." Jezebel disagreed.
"Laurel, we had a deal. If you want me to leave your mother alone, then you need to solve this murder, and fast."
I held up my hands in surrender. "I think it's a waste of time, but sure, I'll investigate them. How about we start with Phil Palmer? I still want you to make the anonymous phone call to the police, though." Jezebel looked put out.
"Why me?"
"Because the police won't recognize Mum's voice. And more to the point, you're the one with all the information on them. Thelma! I turned around to see the source of the ear-splitting shriek, and to my dismay saw Ian. He took a seat in the booth next to Tara. Why don't you have a seat, Ian? My sarcasm was obviously lost on him, because he said, Thanks. He looked at Jezebel and then continued, Thelma, are you coming to the women's night tonight? I quickly spoke up. The doctor said that Mum can't do anything like that, not after the knock on her head. It's too early for her to be having such, fun. But we haven't prepared for it yet, Ian said in a whining tone. Oh yes, I forgot you attend all the women's meetings, I said to Ian to give Jezebel the heads up. I also cleared my throat loudly in an attempt to warn her not to express surprise. To my relief, Jezebel simply nodded. I'm not well enough to come to the meeting. Sorry, Ian, Jezebel said. Ian set the notepad and pen he was holding on the table. Never mind. We can come up with a topic now. I exchanged glances with Tara. Surely this wasn't going to end well. You have any ideas for topics, Thelma? Ian asked her. What about how the youth should be careful about the type of clothes they wear to church? I have an idea, I said. How about a topic based on the verse, Judge not, lest ye be judged? My sarcasm once more went straight over Ian's head. What a great idea, Laurel. He clasped his hands together. But Thelma, the last time I spoke to you, you wanted to organize a prayer group to pray against politicians who weren't in our denomination. I held up a hand to stop him, but he was on a roll. And we were going to organize prayer groups to pray against... I excused myself and hurried to the bathroom. Tara was hard on my heels. Do you think we should leave the two of them alone together? She asked me. I really couldn't listen to Ian any longer, I said. I think he deserves everything he's going to get. We stayed in the bathroom for 5 minutes. I kept checking the time on my phone. Do you think it's safe to go out now? Tara asked me. I shrugged. Probably not, but we can't stay here forever. We walked back out to find Jezebel and Ian still sitting at the table. However, Jezebel was laughing, and Ian appeared to be in shock. One hand was over his eyes, and one hand was over one ear. He was staring straight ahead with his mouth open. Don't tell me, I don't want to know, I said to Jezebel. Chapter 8. Jezebel and I were driving around town looking for a public phone box. They were something of dinosaurs since the advent of mobile phones, but I was sure I had spied one in town somewhere. The only problem was I couldn't remember where I had seen it, and then there was always the likelihood that it didn't work. Still, I couldn't risk the police tracing a call to my mobile phone, or Mum's mobile phone for that matter. So tell me everything you know about Phil Palmer, I said to Jezebel, right after I narrowly missed a group of children on their bikes who had no regard for the road rules. Jezebel scratched Mum's head. He wanted me to go to the local hospital and change his wife's file to say that she suffered from sleep apnea. I drove slowly down a side street in a bad part of town. Did you ask him why? No, of course not. It was none of my business. Besides, he paid well. I sighed. Don't you realize that he must have killed his wife? Jezebel shot me a sharp look. Don't you think that's jumping to conclusions? I silently counted to 5 before answering. What other possible reason could he have? He probably smothered her with a pillow and then wanted everyone to think she died from sleep apnea. There, Jezebel pointed to an old silver phone box. I hit the brakes as she continued. I would agree with you if it happened right now, but it happened 5 years ago. If she died yesterday and he asked me to change the hospital records, then yes, I would think he murdered her. But obviously her death must have been ruled as accidental,
because he's not in prison.
He might have been brought up on charges and released, I said.
Jezebel disagreed. Even so, why would he want me to change old records, 5-year-old records at that? I shrugged and got out of the car.
I put a coin in the slot and remarkably got a dial tone. I signaled to Jezebel to make the call.
Shouldn't I wear gloves or something? She asked me.
This is a small country town, I reminded her. I hardly think the police are going to investigate an anonymous call that closely. Here are some more coins in case you need them. I'll wait in the car. I had only spent about 5 minutes on Instagram when Jezebel returned. How did it go?
Pretty good. I told them everything and then got off the phone as fast as I could in case they traced the call.
I smiled, thinking that Jezebel had watched too much TV. I turned the car in the direction of home. I'm heading for the funeral home office, I told Jezebel. I have a desktop and laptop there, so we can both Google Phil Palmer and look for information on his wife's death. There's surely something online about it. As I drove up to the funeral home, I saw Basil's 2 pet sheep standing by the fence, staring at me. "It's Arthur and Martha," I said to Jezebel. "I forgot to give them their morning treats." I hurried inside and fetched the sheep treats.
"What are those?"
Jezebel asked me. "No idea, only that they're specially made for sheep and they love them," I told her. "Copper can be quite dangerous to sheep, so you have to be careful what you give them." At first, I thought Jezebel would think it strange to have sheep as pets, but then I remembered that she had left all her money to a dog and cat shelter. "That was really good of you to leave all your money to that shelter," I said.
"I'm happy they got my money," she said. "Most people in Australia donate to the big government animal charity, but they make millions of dollars of profit a year, and they're supposed to be a not-for-profit. The small animal shelters get no funding at all, and they really struggle. They can't afford to advertise on TV, and they have a no-kill policy, which sadly those big charities that make millions of dollars don't have. In fact, they have a high kill rate." I shook my head. "It makes no sense at all, does it? The small charities are the ones that need the money. They don't get any government funding at all, and they certainly don't make millions of dollars of profit a year." The sheep accepted the treats gratefully. "Sorry I'm late, guys," I said to them. I turned to Jezebel. "And now, let's get to work and see what we can find on this Phil guy." Soon the two of us were sitting in my office, tapping away at the computers. We both had coffee and cake beside us. I actually preferred the taste of the coffee I made in my little coffee machine to the stuff that I could buy in town. There was little online. "Have you found anything?" I asked Jezebel. She shook her head. "I found the funeral notice, and it all looks quite straightforward. There is nothing about any charges being laid, or any suspicious circumstances. His wife wasn't that old. Surely they'd think it strange that she died in her sleep." "I'm looking at the funeral notice now, too," Jezebel said. "Phil thanks a Dr. Sharp. Maybe we could track down this Dr. Sharp and question him."
"Good idea." I Googled Dr. Sharp, but came up blank. "I can't find him in town. Maybe he's moved on." We both tried to track down Dr. Sharp, with absolutely no luck. "I'm not conducting many funerals this week," I told Jezebel. "I think we should go to the 2 medical centres in town and ask if they know what happened to Dr. Sharp." And so we found ourselves back in town for the 2nd time that day. The first medical centre was at the end of a narrow alleyway. I was glad my car wasn't any bigger, or surely I would have scratched the sides. The parking was meagre. I locked the car and then looked at Jezebel over the roof. "What's our cover story? Why are we looking for him?"
"How about you tell them you're the local funeral director and a card has arrived addressed to him?"
I nodded my appreciation. "Thanks. You're good at this." The abrupt receptionist was no help at all. She simply said she had never heard of him. She suggested I try the other doctor in town. I drove a few streets further on and parked outside the tiny, unassuming green building. "This is our last lead," I told Jezebel. We walked inside, and the receptionist looked up at us expectantly.
"How can I help you?" she asked.
"I'm Laurel Bay from the local funeral home," I told her. "This is my mother, Thelma. We're both most anxious to track down a Dr. Sharp. A card arrived at the funeral home for him, but we've never heard of him."
"I haven't heard of him either," she said. "Why don't you try up at the big medical centre just up on the highway?"
"We tried there first," I said, "and she sent us here. I did Google him first and found out that he had a practice in town 5 years ago." She tapped her pen on her desk.
"I only moved to town last year," she told us. "But if you could wait until the doctor is free, I'll ask him. He's been here for years, so he should know."
I thanked her, and we sat on some hard blue vinyl chairs. The only other person in the waiting room was a stressed mother who was trying to entertain a young child. It seemed like an age before someone emerged from the doctor's room. The receptionist left her desk and hurried into the room. She emerged only a minute later and showed the mother with the child into the room before coming over to me.
"You're in luck," she said. "Dr. Sharp is very elderly, but only retired about 5 years ago. He lives in that big house right next to the Tourist Information Centre."
"He still lives there?" I asked her. She nodded.
"Yes, at least that's what the doctor told me."
"Thanks so much for your help," I said. "I appreciate it."
"What's the plan?"
Jezebel asked me when we were safely out of earshot. I shrugged. "He only lives around the corner, so we can visit him, only he might be defensive if we ask about Phil. Do you think we should buy a card and write in it, and then pretend it was delivered to the funeral home?"
"We can't fake a postmark on an envelope."
I thought about that for a moment. "I know, I'll say I found it in the foyer the other day. If he doesn't believe us, what's he going to do? Then we have to somehow bring the conversation around to Phil Palmer." Once I said it, it sounded difficult, to say the least. Jezebel appeared to be thinking the same thing.
"I don't like our chances, but it's all we've got to go on."
We decided to walk to the doctor's house and stopped on the way to buy a card. I wrote in it, "Thanks for your help, Dr. Sharp." Jezebel looked at the card and snickered. "You have a better idea?" I asked her. She had to admit that she didn't.
"I hope he's home,"
Jezebel said when we were on our way. "If he's not there now, we'll try again tomorrow," I said. We had reached his house, and my stomach churned. The adrenaline rush made my heart race. The house was pretty, sitting at the end of a concrete pathway winding between native bottle brush trees. It was painted a pleasant shade of pale blue, which contrasted nicely with the white shutters and white door. I clutched my stomach and knocked on the door. There was no answer, so after an interval I tried again, louder this time. I heard footsteps and shot Jezebel a look. The door was opened by a wizened old man. He looked like one of the characters from Lord of the Rings, although he was too thin to be a dwarf and too frail to be an elf. He looked at us with rheumy eyes.
"Who are you?"
he asked us with no preamble. "I'm Laurel Bay from the Witchwoods Funeral Home, and this is my mother, Thelma." He cupped his hand around his ear.
"Eh?"
I repeated myself more loudly. "I'm Laurel Bay from the Witchwoods Funeral Home, and this is my mother, Thelma." He took a step backwards.
"There's no need to yell. I'm not buying anything. Good day."
With that, he made to shut the door. "Wait," I said loudly. "We're here because someone left a card for you at the funeral home." I thrust the card at him through the now small gap between the door and the wall. He read the card and then looked at me.
"Who's it from?"
I held up both hands. "I don't know. We found it in the foyer."
"You found it, you say?" he asked me. "Where did you find it?"
"In the foyer," I said loudly. "The foyer at the funeral home."
The man put his hands over his ears. "Please stop yelling. What was that you said again?"
I was beginning to see why this man had signed off on Phil Palmer's wife's death. I was judging how to speak in a voice that he could hear, but not be too loud, when he spoke again.
"Please, come in. Would you like a cup of tea?"
I hurried inside before he could change his mind. Jezebel was hard on my heels. All the curtains were drawn, and I was at once hit with the unpleasant smell of mothballs. The living room, although large, was dark and depressing, and a yellow glow pervaded the room.
"I'll see if I can find some biscuits that aren't stale."
With those encouraging words, he left the room. I heard him muttering in the kitchen. He appeared to be speaking to a teaspoon. He presently returned with 2 cups of tea. His hands were shaking, so much so that the saucers were full of tea and some was dripping onto the floor. He handed me a cup, and I took it before it sloshed all over me. "Thank you."
"I'm not used to guests. A lifetime of work as a doctor has made me turn off people. Now I only like animals, specifically ferrets."
"Ferrets?" I asked him.
"What was that you said?"
"Ferrets," I said more loudly. This time he did not berate me, but pointed to what I had thought was a long, narrow cushion at the side of my chair.
"That's hepatitis, and liver disease is around here somewhere."
I jumped away from the ferret as Jezebel spoke up for the first time.
"You named your ferrets after medical conditions?"
He shook his head.
"No, I don't have a medical condition. I didn't need to retire, you see. But I picked an arbitrary age at which to retire. I chose to retire a few years ago, at 90. I could still be a doctor now. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just that I chose a certain age to retire, and I stuck to it."
An idea formed in my mind. "I was speaking to one of your old patients the other day. He spoke well of you."
"What was that you said? Speak up, girlie."
"Phil Palmer," I yelled. "He said you were very good. You were his wife's doctor when she died?" This time he heard me.
"Yes, very sad. Phil Palmer grew up in this town, and then he went to Newcastle for some years before he came back here. I was his doctor from the time he was a child."
He went on and on, telling me all the patients he had treated from childhood. I finally managed to get a word in when he paused to pat one of his ferrets. "Wasn't Mrs. Palmer too young to die?" He nodded.
"Everyone is really too young to die, when you think about it. She was a nice woman."
"What did she die of?" I said loudly and slowly.
"Can't you remember?"
He narrowed his eyes at me.
"My memory is as sharp as a tack. I remember that day as if it was yesterday. She died in her sleep."
"Do young people die in their sleep?" I asked him. The doctor stopped stroking one of the ferrets and looked up at me.
"She did."
"Phil said there was never a post-mortem." He nodded.
"Yes, she died of natural causes. Phil told me that he was too upset about his wife's death and didn't want an autopsy. He told me that she died in her sleep."
"And you believed him?" I said, incredulous.
"Tim? Who's Tim? I thought you were talking about Phil Palmer. Who is this Tim that I believe?"
I nodded to Jezebel, and we both stood up. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Sharp," I said. "Sorry to have bothered you."
"I don't like people," he muttered. "Had to go to all the trouble of making you tea, and you didn't even drink it."
I muttered my apologies, and we hurried out the door as fast as we could.
"He's as mad as a hatter,"
Jezebel said, before we had even reached the footpath.
"Shush, he'll hear you,"
I warned her. Jezebel snorted rudely.
"He's as deaf as a post. His records would never have been computerized. and he's probably lost them all by now. Oh well, at least we found out Phil Palmer's wife never had an autopsy and why the police weren't alerted. The doctor signed off on the death certificate as natural causes. Yes, and I know that the police are only called to a death if the doctor thinks the circumstances are suspicious, I told her. That's why Mrs. Palmer's death was never investigated. Put that together with Phil Palmer asking you to change her hospital records to sleep apnea, and we can only draw one conclusion. Phil Palmer murdered his wife.
That doesn't mean he murdered me, Jezebel pointed out.
I nodded. True. I'll bet you anything that he had his wife cremated, so there's absolutely no evidence at all. I don't suppose you kept any records anywhere, such as backup copies or anything detailing the hacker work you did? Jezebel shook her head.
No, I made sure I covered my tracks.
That means we'll never prove that he murdered his wife, I said. But the thing that puzzles me is, why did he want you to change the hospital records now? I turned off the main road in the direction of the funeral home.
Hello, Jezebel said. I think we have established that he got away with his wife's murder and that we can't do anything about it. Shouldn't we be focusing on my murder now? We still need to investigate Daisy Fairchild and Donnie Fairchild.
I pulled the car off the road, quite a feat, as someone was tailgating me. I wrote the Fairchild's address in my notes. I'll open it in Maps, and you can navigate to their address. I handed my phone to Jezebel.
What do you want me to do with your phone? An angry voice snapped. And Laurel, why am I wearing a hat?
Chapter 9. I gasped. Luckily, I was on the side of the road. If I had been driving, I would have run off the road. I turned to the person sitting next to me.
Mum?
She glared at me.
Who else would it be, Laurel? Sometimes I wonder about your sanity. Why are we parked on the side of the road? You know, Laurel, you always were trouble. Have I ever told you that you took 3 days to be born? Yes, you took 3 days to be born, and you've been nothing but trouble ever since.
I stared at Mum. Had Jezebel gone for good? I looked around, but I couldn't see her ghost. Mum was on a roll.
I went to the bathroom, and a lady asked me whether I'd had a boy or a girl. I had to tell her that I hadn't had it yet. Can you imagine how that made me feel? I had never been so embarrassed in my whole entire life. You were trouble then, and you're trouble now.
A string of foul language emanated from her mouth, and that gave me hope.
Jezebel?
She nodded.
That was a horrible feeling. Your mum forced me into the background.
I shuddered. Get a grip, Jezebel. Try not to let it happen again. And if it does, see if you can give me some warning, I said as an afterthought.
I'll do my best, but that came out of nowhere, she said in a shaky voice. It was horrible.
It was pretty horrible for me, too, I admitted. I don't know how, but try to keep Mum out of the way until we find out who murdered you.
Getting used to having me around, are you?
Jezebel asked with a smile. I pulled a face. If it's a choice between you and my mother, you win hands down. Okay then, direct me to the Fairchild's house. The Fairchild's house was on the north edge of town, on a steep slope with a hill behind it. It was massive, but looked dated from the front. It seemed that various owners had added to it over the years. The approach was up a steep, winding road with signs warning to watch out for koalas on the way. A small red BMW was parked next to the house. The entry itself was unimpressive. A small concrete path, flanked by cheap garden solar lighting, led to an unattractive A-frame addition of a dark and gloomy porch. I rang the bell and heard it echo throughout the house.
I sure hope Donnie isn't home,
Jezebel whispered to me. Don't worry about that. Just make sure my mother doesn't pop out when we're in the middle of speaking to Daisy, I said. A woman opened the door. From the amount of heavy gold jewelry hanging around her neck, I guessed she wasn't the cleaning lady. "Daisy Fairchild?" I asked her. "Yes," she said warily. "This is rather a delicate matter," I said. "I'm Laurel Bay. I own Witchwood's funeral home, and I recently conducted the funeral for Jezebel. This is my mother, Thelma." Daisy looked around nervously. I pressed on. "Jezebel was a friend of mine, and a few days before she died, she told me she was worried for your safety." Daisy was clearly taken aback. "The police haven't mentioned anything to me." I nodded. "Jezebel must have sensed that something was going to happen to her. She said if anything happened to her, she wanted me to tell you she was worried for your safety, but she asked me not to inform the police because it was a delicate matter." I wondered if Daisy would believe such a preposterous lie, but it seemed that she did. "Come in," she said. "If my husband comes home, pretend you're collecting for a charity or something like that." I thanked her, and we followed her into the house. The house inside was bright and airy, filled with lots of natural light. One wall was of huge picture windows overlooking the ground in front of the house, as well as the highway heading north out of town. There was a bushland reserve on the other side of the highway, so the outlook was quite pleasant, if you didn't mind the constant stream of trucks and cars. Heavy lace curtains hung from the windows, but they had been pulled back. An old-fashioned china cabinet filled with every manner of china ornament stood next to the massive fireplace. The wall behind it was covered with photos, I assumed of relatives. The furniture itself was gloomy, beige sofas and an overly heavy wooden coffee table sitting on beige carpet. Beige-grey heavy curtains hung on the windows on the opposite side of the wall, and the living room opened onto the kitchen, which was white with stainless steel appliances. The whole impression was one of misery. Daisy indicated we should sit on one of the sofas, and she headed for the kitchen. "Tea, coffee, cold drink?" "You have any good Scottish whiskey?" Jezebel asked. Daisy fetched a bottle of whiskey from the bar, while I forced a loud laugh. "Mum's joking. She's never had any alcohol in her life." I shot Jezebel a pointed look. "We'd both like coffee, please." Daisy left the whiskey bottle on the table and went to pour the coffee, leaving me wondering what would happen if Mum suddenly forced her way back into her body when Jezebel was halfway through drinking whiskey. Daisy set a coffee mug in front of me and offered me a caramel Tim Tam. She did the same for Jezebel. Daisy then took a seat and came straight to the point. "I suppose Jezebel told you all about my husband Donny having an affair?" I nodded. "Yes, she did. I told my mother everything that Jezebel told me, so she knows as much as I do." I wiggled my eyebrows at Jezebel to give her the hint to interrupt or to take over the conversation at any point. She nodded slightly in response. "One thing I didn't understand from Jezebel is the fact that you haven't divorced your husband. Wouldn't it be easier to divorce him?" Daisy gripped her coffee mug. "I do want to divorce him, but I'm treading carefully because I'm afraid of him." "Has he ever been violent to you?" I asked with concern. She shook her head. "He's never been physically violent, but he's been very verbally abusive. I'm afraid of him." "I know this isn't a very nice question," I said, "but do you think he could have possibly murdered Jezebel?" Daisy turned her coffee mug around several times before answering. "I wouldn't be surprised. Like I said, he's never actually hit me, but he does throw furniture. He threw a television through that glass wall right there." She pointed to the center glass wall on the side with the view. "He punches holes in walls for trivial reasons. You never know what will set him off. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he murdered Jezebel." "You wouldn't?" Jezebel said. Daisy stirred some sugar into her coffee. "Yes, I did wonder whether he did. The thing is, he flies into a rage at the drop of a hat. You never know what's going to set him off.
but I don't think he would plan anything bad. He goes into a rage for no reason usually, but the police said it was a stolen car. I can imagine if he had been speaking to Jezebel, he could have gone into a rage and murdered her. But I don't think he's the type to plan to steal a car and then go and hit her with it. Am I making sense? Jezebel and I nodded. So have you come to the conclusion that your husband didn't do it? I asked her, just to clarify matters for myself. She shrugged. I know he's got the temper to do it, and he's a very nasty person. I would think he had done it, only for the fact that he only goes into murderous rages just after something sets him off, and he cools down fairly quickly. We need to speak with him, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. No, that wouldn't be safe at all, Daisy said, clearly terrified.
We should speak to him in a social setting so as not to make him suspicious,
Jezebel offered. I nodded my approval. Good idea. Daisy, is Donnie attending any upcoming social events? Daisy sipped her coffee and then added more sugar. I got a whiff of her expensive French perfume as she did so, and I wondered why she was sitting alone in her house, wearing French perfume and a lot of jewelry. I wondered if she had just returned from a liaison with a lover, but if she had, I couldn't see how that would connect with Jezebel's murder. Why do you want to speak to Donnie? She asked me. I thought you ran the funeral home. You're not a private detective, are you? I shook my head. I'm sure the police are doing a good job. It's just that Jezebel was a close friend, and she asked me to investigate if something happened to her. Oh gosh, my story was getting more fanciful by the minute. First I had told Daisy that Jezebel wanted me to say she was worried for her safety, and now I was telling her that I was investigating Jezebel's death. Still, it seemed that Daisy was swallowing my story. Well, the chook sale is on this afternoon, she said.
Chook sale?
Jezebel echoed. Yes, chooks. You know, chickens, fowl, hens, I told her. Daisy drained her coffee before continuing. The monthly chook sale is on this afternoon, and after that there's a big charity sale. He's going to that.
It's probably too late to get tickets,
Jezebel said. Daisy laughed. It's not a charity ball or anything like that. It's just a charity sale, an auction to raise money to send hay to the sheep farmers out west. They're still in a terrible drought. Haven't you heard of those trucks that take hay out west to sheep farmers in drought? It's a big charity. Yes, I've heard of it, I said. So the event tonight is just like a clearing sale? It's more fancy than a clearing sale, but not as fancy as a charity ball, Daisy said. I'm not going. She fidgeted as she said it, and I was sure she was up to something. Still, that was absolutely none of my business, not if it didn't have anything to do with Jezebel's death. I thanked her and stood up to go, but when Jezebel was halfway out of her seat, she fell back into it. Laurel, she said in a weak voice. Just then the front door flew open. Who are these people? A heavily set man demanded. I went straight into the cover story. I'm Laurel, and this is my mother Thelma. We're collecting for the church. Jezebel's eyes popped open.
Church? We're collecting for the church? Why didn't you say so, Laurel?
Daisy looked strained. Donnie, Laurel and Thelma were just leaving. Mum went straight into people-pleasing mode. I could tell by her tone that she had overcome Jezebel again. She hurried over to Donnie and offered her hand, which he duly shook.
Such a lovely house you have here. I haven't seen you at our church. Will I see you there this Sunday?
No, he said, pushing past her. He looked at the whiskey bottle. Did somebody drink my whiskey? Mum gasped.
Certainly not. I have never let a drop of the demon alcohol pass my lips. I signed the Baptist pledge against hard drink when I was 8, and I always keep my word.
Donnie looked Mum up and down and then turned to his wife.
Daisy, show these people out, won't you?" Daisy hurried us both to the door and all but pushed us out.
"Did we collect much money?"
Mum said loudly as we walked to my car. Chapter 10. By the time I reached my car, Jezebel was back, to my enormous relief. "Twice in a short space of time?" I asked Jezebel. "That's getting a little too much. Did she give you any warning this time?" Jezebel shook her head.
"No, although I did get a really horrible feeling both times, so perhaps I can take that as a warning."
"If you get another horrible feeling like that again, please let me know," I said. "That could have been really awful."
"What do we do now?"
Jezebel asked me. "We should go back home and get changed. Then we'll go to the charity sale."
"How should I dress?"
I smothered a giggle. "Go just as you are. Mum always wears those clothes."
"But surely I should dress up for a charity sale?"
Jezebel asked me. "Wear a strand of pearls if you like," I said, "but remember that you look like my mother." Jezebel's face paled.
"I'd almost forgotten."
I had to do some paperwork for upcoming funerals for the next few hours. Luckily, I didn't hear from either Mum or Jezebel. When I called for Jezebel late in the afternoon, she told me that my mother hadn't made another appearance. We drove to the local showground, which was hosting the charity sale, in the big pavilion next to the chook sale. As we drove up, people were leaving a large white building, some clutching cages of chickens, and some with chooks under their arms. After I parked the car and got out, I heard someone discussing the relative merits of Ancona show hens.
"It seems a bit weird to me that they're selling these chickens and then having a charity function," Jezebel said.
"This is perfectly normal for a small country town," I said. "You obviously haven't mixed in these circles. Let's go inside and start mingling. Remember, warn me if you think my mother is about to take over you. Do your best to resist."
"I don't know how,"
Jezebel said in a pained tone. I took a deep breath and hoped it would all turn out okay. I hadn't known how to dress for the occasion, so I had chosen a dark green dress cut in such a way as to hide a multitude of sins, or so I hoped. "Oh, wow. Laurel, you look amazing," said a deep voice behind me. I swung around to see Basil. He held me at arm's length. "Wow," he said again, and then kissed me. "I'm so pleased you could make it," I said. "Are you still coming back for dinner tonight?" He pulled me close and whispered in my ear, "Sure am," before kissing me again. My heart beat out of my chest, and my knees trembled. Basil always had that effect on me. When he released me, I gasped. Basil's arm tightened around my waist. "I didn't realize I had that effect on you," he said with a laugh. "You don't know the half of it," I said silently. Aloud, I said, "That's Liliana Buckley. Phil Palmer has his arm around her. What if his wife sees them?" "She's his wife," Basil said. "Liliana and Phil are married." "I didn't make the connection," I said in surprise. "I'm conducting Liliana's father's funeral the day after tomorrow." Jezebel's jaw dropped open.
"You know how long they've been married?"
she asked Basil. He stroked his chin. 4 or 5 years, I think." "That means he married her right after his wife died," I said. I was unable to say any more because someone tapped the microphone in an irritating way that sent a high-pitched sound throughout the room. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," the voice said in a monotone. "Let's hope we raise a lot of money to send hay to the sheep farmers out west. There is no end in sight for this drought, and they're doing it tough out west. Let's see how many trucks of hay we can send to them." There was a polite round of applause. "If anyone hasn't registered for the auction, please do so now, because the sale is about to commence," the man droned on. "Remember to show your paddle when you bid. Everyone, take their seats, please. I'd like to introduce a local sheep farmer, Tom Blanche, who can tell us all about the difficulties of feeding sheep in the drought." Tom Blanche, a large portly man with bright red cheeks and a can of beer in his left hand, took the microphone and tapped it, sending that irritating sound reverberating through the building.
"How are yous going?" he said. "I'm Tom Blanche, and I'm struggling to feed my sheepdogs because of the drought." "He's obviously not struggling to feed himself," Jezebel said, and I had to elbow her in the ribs. Tom made a very long speech. When he was halfway through complaining about sheep shearers calling wet wool when it had barely rained at all, I saw Donny Fairchild and an attractive young woman slip out the side door. I pointed this out to both Basil and Jezebel. "Did she have long blonde hair?" Jezebel asked me. I nodded. "I saw him with her earlier, and they were looking overly friendly, if you get my meaning," she said. Tom Blanche handed the microphone back to the first man who had spoken, who had neglected to give us his name. He gleefully announced that a local car dealer had donated a new Holden ute which would be auctioned at the end of the night. "And we also have for auction a new stainless steel barbecue, a set of portable sheep yards, a stock saddle, R.M. Williams boots, a vintage wool bale lifter, a square bale baler tractor." As he continued, I zoned out. I was drifting off to sleep when Basil tapped me on the shoulder and nodded over to the door. Donny Fairchild and the young woman were walking back into the room. It was clear that they had only just got dressed, as Donny was tucking in his shirt and their hair was sticking out in all directions. The auction continued, and there was a general buzz of excitement in the room about the amount of money being made. Finally, the part I was waiting for, the end of the auction. The Holden ute brought a tidy sum of money. It was bought by 5 hard-faced men in black suits who looked stereotypically like the mafia of movies. The nameless man stood up and droned on about how much money had been made and how grateful the sheep farmers out west would be. He sang the praises of the man who had started the charity for providing hay to drought-stricken farmers, but neglected to name him too. Maybe the man just had a problem with names. Finally, he announced that everyone was welcome to stay for tea and coffee, pavlovas and lamingtons. "I don't like lamingtons," Jezebel said to me as an aside. "I'm not fond of shredded coconut." "You can't be Australian if you don't like lamingtons," Basil said for a joke. "Enough happy banter," I said. "We need to speak to Donny Fairchild. Jezebel, are you up for it? Mum's not about to take over, is she?" Jezebel made a strangled sound, and I clutched Basil's arm. Right then, a young man walked over to us. "Are yous enjoying the night?" There was a loud sound of annoyance next to me. "We're not sheep, young man. What are they teaching you in school these days? Yous are sheep. The second-person pronoun is the same for both singular and plural. It is you, not yous. If you were addressing more than one person, you would still say, 'Are you enjoying the night?' Do you understand?"
The young man simply hurried away by way of response. Mum rounded on me.
"What am I doing here, Laurel? This can't be a church function, given the poor grammar."
"It's a charity function, Mum," I said.
"There is none charitable, none but God," Mum said, in what I assume was a misquotation of a Bible verse. "The church is the only true charity."
She then let out a string of swear words. "Oh, good, you're back, Jezebel," I said, relieved. Jezebel nodded.
"It was quite a struggle. At least I had a bit of warning that time."
"Has this happened before?" Basil said in alarm. "It sure has," I said. "Jezebel, we must speak to Donny Fairchild before he goes off with that woman for the night. Basil, I haven't had a chance to tell you. Jezebel and I went to speak with Daisy Fairchild today, and Donny turned up right when we were about to leave." "So he recognizes you," Basil said. "I don't like it, Laurel. If he's the murderer, then you could be in danger. Can't you leave it to the police this time?" The police don't seem to be getting anywhere, and I made Jezebel a deal that she will leave when I solve her murder, and then we'll have Mum back." Basil muttered words to the effect that he didn't want Mum back. I found it hard to disagree with him. "It will probably play into our hands that he recognises us," I added, "because we told him that we were collecting for Mum's church. Jezebel, Mum would typically strong-arm someone into going to her church. I think it's a good idea if you strong-arm Donnie into going to Mum's church, because that will give us a way to speak to him."
"Are you sure I should strong-arm him?" Jezebel said, her tone filled with doubt.
I nodded. "That's what Mum would do, and if he asks around later, that behaviour would fit in. After you do that, I'll interrupt and mention you to see his reaction." "It doesn't sound like a good plan to me," Basil said. "I should come with you to protect you." "Sure." We looked around for Donnie, and to our dismay, he was leaving by the back door. There was no sign of his girlfriend, so I assumed they didn't want anyone to see them leave together. I grabbed Jezebel's arm. "Quick, let's go. Do you remember what to do?" She nodded. We hurried after Donnie and reached him only moments before he got into his car. "Donnie," I called. He turned around, the look of annoyance plain on his face under the overhead lights on the wall.
"We didn't get a chance to speak earlier about coming to my church,"
Jezebel said. Donnie said rather a rude word, and the next thing I knew, Jezebel had him in an arm lock. I gasped and did a double take. When I looked again, sure enough, Donnie was lying face down in the dirt. Jezebel was twisting his arm behind him and had her knee on his back. "What are you doing?" Basil asked in horror. I was still speechless.
"I'm strong-arming him into going to church, like you said I should," Jezebel said in bewilderment. "I didn't think it was a good idea, but you insisted."
"Let him up, quick," Basil insisted. Donnie struggled to his feet and brushed himself off. "That old bat is crazy," he said, spitting dirt out of his mouth. "I'm going to call the cops and have her charged with assault." I took a step closer to him. "You do that, and I'll tell your wife that we all saw you go into a room with that young woman." "Are you spying on me for my wife?" he said angrily. I shook my head. "I'm a private investigator. I've been hired by a relative of yours." I waved my finger in his face. "Your wife knows nothing about this. You'll never guess which relative of yours is working against you. You had better watch your back. My client told me not to tell your wife about your affair yet, but I'm sure I will at some point." Donnie went white and then jumped in his car. He slammed his door so hard that it's a wonder it stayed on its hinges and sped away with a squeal of tires.
"Did I do something wrong?"
Jezebel said in a small voice. I sighed. "When I said to strong-arm him, I didn't mean to put him in a literal arm lock," I explained. "It's an expression that simply means to put verbal pressure on someone."
"Oh, I see,"
Jezebel said, in a tone which clearly demonstrated that she did not see at all. "It's all right," I said. "I'll take you back to Mum's." Basil caught my arm. He nodded to the 5 men in black suits who were speaking angrily with someone. "That's Harper," Jezebel whispered. Chapter 11. I'd barely had any sleep the previous night. Considering that I had to swap dinner with Basil and a possible sleepover for a girls' night with Jezebel. Jezebel said she couldn't possibly stay alone, as she was frightened of Mum. Jezebel had talked until about 5 in the morning, so I felt like a zombie when I woke up at 8. We had discussed the suspects over and over again and had not come to any firm conclusion. Jezebel was still insisting that Harper couldn't possibly have murdered her, but she did agree with me when I said we had to explore all options. I had popped back to my apartment to have a shower. After all, it was only a stone's throw away, and then had 2 cups of my nice coffee from my coffee machine. I was back in Mum's house, making coffee for Jezebel when she emerged.
"It feels weird cleaning your mother's teeth," she said. "Still, I figure it's my responsibility to keep her in good order, since I'm inhabiting her for the moment."
"That's kind of you," I said.
"But as for having a shower—"
She shuddered. "I don't want to know," I said. "Too much information. Now, what conclusion did we come to last night? I'm still half asleep."
"You said you think Harper owes a lot of money to the wrong sort of people, and that would give him a motive for killing me because he couldn't afford to pay it back. You kept saying that, and I kept saying that Harper didn't do it."
I rubbed my temples. "It's all coming back to me. We are going to speak to Harper under the guise of pretending that we think Lottie did it." Jezebel interrupted me.
"Yes, and since he's already had her arrested for assault, there wouldn't be any love lost between them."
"Yes, as we kept saying last night," I said. "So I'll ask him if he has any information he can give the police. We'll tell him that we're friends of yours and that you confided in me that you were worried about his gambling problem."
"He always has a break at 10, Jezebel said. "His boss at the music shop is very rigid and insists he takes a break at precisely 10 every morning. He always leaves by the back door, which is in an alley. We'll wait for him there."
And so, filled with caffeine, Jezebel and I stood at the back of the music shop at 5 to 10. I insisted on being there early, but Jezebel said that he would come out at precisely 10. She proved to be right. As Harper emerged from the back door, a look of shock covered his face when he saw us. "Do you remember me?" I asked him. "Of course," he said. "You run the funeral home. You did Jezebel's funeral. Of course I remember you." "This is my mother, Thelma," I said, "and we were good friends with Jezebel. She confided in us that she was worried about your gambling problem, and we want to ask you if there's anything we can do to help." Jezebel held up her hands.
"I know that sounds presumptuous of us, but we were such good friends with Jezebel, and we want to do this for her. Is there anything we can do to help?"
I nodded. Jezebel was worried you were involved with the wrong sort of people, that you owed the wrong sort of people money. Harper took a step backwards and eyed us with suspicion. "Jezebel never mentioned either of you." "I think she was embarrassed about us," I said, "because we look kind of normal." Jezebel shot me a dirty look. Harper appeared to be thinking it over, and then said, "You," he nodded to Jezebel, "you look way too conservative to be a friend of Jezebel's."
"Ask me something private about Jezebel, and I'll prove that I know it," Jezebel said.
Harper shifted from one foot to the other. "What was Jezebel's real name?"
"Annabel Judson," Jezebel said.
Harper narrowed his eyes. "You could have found that online."
"I don't think it is online," Jezebel said.
"What do you want?" Harper said, still clearly suspicious. "I only have a short break, so can you come to the point?" "The point is that Jezebel was worried you are involved with the mafia or something. She was worried they were threatening you. She told us how much money you borrowed from her, and she was afraid that they would harm you if you didn't pay them back." Harper folded his arms over his chest. "Who are you really?" "You know I run the funeral home," I said. "We are who we say we are." Harper shook his head. "Jezebel would never be friends with people like you." He looked from me to Mum. "I can see her being friends with you," he said, pointing to me, and then to Jezebel, "but not someone like you. Jezebel would never be friends with someone like you."
"Appearances can be deceptive," Jezebel said. "Jezebel and I were such good friends that we have matching tattoos."
Harper snorted rudely, a snort that disintegrated into raucous laughter. "Sure. Have you women come here to make fun of me?"
"We have matching tattoos in the very same place," Jezebel insisted.
"What a load of," Harper said, and then his jaw fell open. He went the most ghastly shade of pale green I have ever seen, and then I looked beside me. Jezebel had ripped off her shirt.
Apparently, she wasn't one to wear one of Mum's bras, and I got a very good look at a large, colourful tattoo of a flaming skull on a certain part of her anatomy. I stood there, frozen to the spot, not knowing what to do, when I spied Stephen Stonewall, the reporter. He was writing furiously in his notepad. I only hoped he hadn't whipped his camera out at the wrong moment. When I looked back at Jezebel, thankfully she had covered up. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Harper said. "You must have been really good friends with Jezebel. That tattoo is exactly like the one Jezebel had. I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," said. "I'll probably be in therapy for years now."
Jezebel took over the conversation.
"So the reason we're here is that Jezebel was very worried about your gambling, and she wants you to get help for it. She was worried that some mafia-type guys were leaning on you to pay them back, and she was wondering if you could get help for your gambling. Isn't there something like Gamblers Anonymous or something like that?"
While Harper seemed pleased that Mum, a.k.a. Jezebel, was friends with Jezebel, he was highly defensive about his gambling. "I don't have a gambling problem anymore," he said.
"Gamblers and addicts always say that," Jezebel said, coming straight to the point. Jezebel lent you over $200,000. Only someone with a serious gambling problem could be in debt to that degree, and Jezebel thought that you hadn't paid it back to your creditors. She was right, wasn't she?"
Harper looked at his shoes, so I added, "Last night Mum and I saw you at the charity auction. We were just leaving, and we saw those 5 mafia-looking guys speaking to you, and they seemed really angry." "I can pay them back," Harper said. "Believe me, I'll stop gambling now. What happened to Jezebel gave me such a fright that I stopped gambling on the spot. I don't owe those men much money anymore, and I've just applied for a credit card to pay them back." Jezebel groaned.
"A credit card, Harper? Seriously?"
"It's not ideal, but it's better than being killed," I said. "I don't owe them that much money," Harper said. "Nobody is getting killed." "Jezebel did," I pointed out. Harper looked at his watch. "Jezebel wasn't killed over money. Anyway, my break's over. I have to get back inside." "How do you know Jezebel wasn't killed over money?" I asked him. Harper turned back to me. "I meant she wasn't killed because I owed money to anyone. That's what I meant." He hurried back into the shop. "Do you still think he didn't have anything to do with your murder?" I asked Jezebel. She was silent for a few moments before answering.
"I'm sure he didn't murder me, but do you think those mafia men might have murdered me as a sign to him?"
"Surely not," I said. "That's going a bit far. Then again, who knows?" We walked down the alley to my car when the reporter jumped out at us. I let out a shriek of surprise, followed by, "Are you following us?" "I'm just doing my job. I seriously think you need to take your mother back to the church. Clearly the deliverance didn't work on her," he chuckled.
"If you took any photos, we'll sue you," Jezebel said.
"We'll see about that," Stephen said smugly. "Do you have a quote for me?" I clamped my hand over Jezebel's mouth. "No, she doesn't." Chapter 12. I was excited because Basil was coming over to my house for dinner, and I hoped he would stay the night. Following Tara's directions, weeks ago I had set up a protective magical barrier around my apartment so that ghosts could not get in. I didn't want any ghostly eyes intruding on my privacy. I languished in a long, hot bubble bath that was filled with luscious rose and vanilla fragrance, and then slipped on a flattering summer dress. I hoped there would be no emergencies tonight. I had done all the preparation work for the funeral the next day, the funeral of Liliana's father. There were still some things left to do, but they could all be easily taken care of the following morning. 5 minutes before Basil was due to arrive, I turned off my mobile phone and pulled the landline out of the wall. My relationship with Basil had moved to the next level at tax time, his busiest time of year, so we hadn't had much time to spend with each other. I'd like to say I had cooked a delicious meal, but truth be told, I had ordered it from a local restaurant. Still, by the time I plated it up, it would look home-cooked. The front doorbell sounded, and I hurried out to let Basil in. Ernie appeared and gave me the thumbs up. He whistled at me. "Where have you been lately, Ernie?" I asked him. "You've been conspicuous by your absence." He shrugged. "Your mother creeps me out." "You and me both. What else is new?" I asked him. "That's never worried you before." He faded in and out for a moment. "It's just that your mother is possessed. That's really scary." I had no idea how to respond. I opened the door and Basil swept me into his arms. "Not here. We have an audience." Ernie appeared to be insulted. "I'm not a voyeur," he said in an offended tone, and then vanished. I walked as fast as I could to my apartment without appearing too eager, and then firmly shut the door behind Basil. "Alone at last," I said. "No ghostly eyes here." Basil slipped an arm around my waist and pulled me into his arms. He pressed his lips to my cheek, and for a moment we stood there in each other's arms. Then he kissed me, and I had to grab onto his solid arms to stop myself from toppling backwards. "What's that delightful aroma?" he asked. "Malaysian satay," I said. "Unless you're talking about me, in which case it's rose and vanilla." Basil smiled and nuzzled my neck, which had the usual effect of making me go weak at the knees. I wondered if we could forego dinner altogether, but then Basil said, "Let's eat. I'm starving." Basil and I walked hand in hand to my kitchen. "Can I help?" he asked me. "Thanks, but all the preparation is done," I said. I didn't happen to add that someone else had done the preparation. The Malaysian satay was delicious. I was fishing the salted caramel ice cream out of the freezer when the front door buzzer sounded loudly. "I'm not going to answer that," I said to Basil. "What if it's the police?" he asked me. "Surely they'd call first," I said, but then I realized that my phones were turned off. The buzzing was relentless, so I gave up. I walked with long strides to the front door, furious with whoever would be standing there. I flung the door open to see Jezebel. "Jezebel, I told you I was having dinner with Basil tonight." She stood aside a little, and I saw Ian behind her. "Laurel, the Bible says to respect your elders," he admonished me. "You shouldn't call your mother names. I know she had a little problem with demons, but she's over that now. Though she was scarlet, she's been washed as white as snow." Jezebel grimaced. I could see by the lack of mean expression on her face that she wasn't Mum. I raised my eyebrows at her, looking for an explanation. Jezebel wasted no time in giving me one. "I was watching TV by myself, when who should call by but Ian?" She shot him a fake smile. "What a pleasant surprise that was. Anyway, I'm still recovering from the knock on my head, so I thought I should invite you and Basil over." Ian eyed us suspiciously. "You two aren't living in sin, are you? Fornicators will not inherit the kingdom of God." "There is no chance of fornication around here, Ian," I said crisply. He nodded his approval, but then I added, "Not with you visiting us." Ian appeared puzzled by my words. "Anyway, Ian, you and Audrey are living together. Isn't that fornication? Why is it all right for you and not for anyone else?" Ian frowned. "That's different." I was about to ask why it was different when Jezebel spoke. "I told Ian I was tired, but he insisted upon staying, which is why I thought I should come and get you, Laurel." "Good idea, Mum," I said. "Basil and I can pop over for a short time until Ian goes." I hoped Ian would get the hint, but if he did, it would be the first time. I trudged the short distance to Mum's house, disappointed that my romantic evening with Basil was ruined. When Basil and I walked into the living room, I saw a huge Bible open on the coffee table.
Ian wanted me to read from the Bible, Jezebel said.
Thelma and I often spend evenings reading from that particular Bible, Ian said, so I thought I'd bring it over to help Thelma return to some sort of normalcy. She seemed to be having trouble with the words, though, which is not like her.
Mum hasn't been herself lately, I told him. Not since that big knock on her head.
Ian folded his arms over his chest. Let's call a spade, Laurel. There is nothing hidden that shall not come to light. Everything hidden under a bushel is always found. Thelma needed deliverance, and that's why she wasn't herself. It happened before she had the head injury. He waved his hand. Anyway, let's not look at the past, but forge on to the future. Why don't we all take turns reading this Bible?
I looked at the Bible and saw it was quite a fancy one with long drop caps in a flowery font. This is a very elaborate Bible. It must be worth a fortune.
Ian's face lit up. It's a family heirloom. Some people have trouble reading it because the letter S in this ancient Bible looks like the modern letter F. Now, why don't I just fetch some refreshments and we can all sit around and read a chapter each?
Sounds like a load of fun, I said sarcastically.
Ian nodded enthusiastically. Quite so.
He disappeared into the kitchen, but soon reappeared wearing a deep frown.
What's this tool of the devil I found in the refrigerator?
He held up a bottle of wine.
That's non-alcoholic wine, Jezebel said, as quick as a flash. Do you go to that little supermarket on the far side of town?
Ian shook his head.
They sell it there, Jezebel said.
Non-alcoholic wine? What a good idea,
Ian said over his shoulder as he disappeared into the kitchen. He soon returned with 4 coffee mugs and filled each with what he thought was non-alcoholic wine.
Where's Audrey? I asked him. Ian took a gulp of the wine and then smiled primly. Audrey is too tired to come out at night for Bible readings. Thelma and I finished reading the book of Philemon last time, so we're up to the book of Hebrews. Of course, we're reading the King James Version, the only Bible written by God. He indicated that we should all sit around the huge Bible, and he turned to the first chapter of Hebrews. The Bible was magnificent. Line drawings on most pages, and the edges were gold. I gulped my wine, and then went to the kitchen to fetch more. Jezebel must have bought it after she discharged herself from hospital. When I returned, I refilled the mugs, but was careful not to refill Ian's. To my dismay, he grabbed the bottle and topped up his own mug. "We're up to chapter 2 now, Laurel," he said. Was I imagining it, or was his speech slurred? I shot a look at Jezebel. She, too, appeared to be under the weather, and then I realized that it made sense. After all, she was in Mum's body, and Mum had never partaken of alcohol in her life. "I'll read verse 17, Ian said, as Jezebel continued to giggle to herself. Ian hiccuped. "Wherefore in all things it behoved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest, in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people." Ian read smugly. He hiccuped again, and then said, "Your turn, Thelma."
"Ian, it isn't an F, it's an S. It only looks like an F," I said. Ian giggled wildly in response. Jezebel sighed and leant over the Bible.
"For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he, if able to
"That's enough," I said loudly, and slammed the Bible shut. I had seen the rest of the verse. He is able to succour them that are tempted. "Come on, Ian. Basil and I will drive you home."
"But my car is here," he protested, "and we haven't finished reading the whole book of Hebrews."
"You can save that for another time," I said.
That will give you something to look forward to."
"But my car is outside," he protested again. "I'm not going anywhere. You can't make me."
He took another slurp of wine, but missed his mouth and poured wine down his shirt. I shook my head and signalled to Basil. He followed me into the kitchen. "What are we going to do?" Basil asked me. "I'll ring Audrey." It turned out that Audrey took it quite well. I explained that there had been a mix-up with the non-alcoholic wine and that Ian had actually consumed the alcoholic wine. Audrey didn't go to Mum's church, so she was quite a reasonable person. She said she would call over to collect him presently. We walked back into the living room to see Ian and Jezebel taking turns to read the Bible. "It's a wonder this didn't make Mum emerge," I said to Basil. "This is quite her thing." "Perhaps your mother can't bear how they're pronouncing it," Basil said, "so she's hiding. Jezebel is reading 2 Corinthians, chapter 6, verse 2. I looked over Jezebel's shoulder at the part she was up to. "Have I succored thee?" Oh no, I winced. Chapter 13. I sat across from Reverend Brown in my office. A pleasant man, Reverend Brown was a local Uniting Church minister who usually conducted the non-denominational funeral services. He was always easy to deal with, and I never had any problems with him. I was, however, worried about upcoming funerals, given that Jezebel was still possessing Mum. My biggest fear was that Mum would take over Jezebel at some point during a funeral and make a big scene. This time I thought I might be in luck. When I last checked on her, Jezebel was still sleeping off a bad hangover. While Jezebel could no doubt hold her drink, it was quite another thing for Mum's body to do so. Liliana Buckley had informed me that her father, Hector, had died from a chronic illness. The gossip around town had informed me that Hector had made his fortune in real estate. He had bought up considerable amounts of what was then considered to be wasteland near various isolated Queensland beaches decades earlier, and then, in recent times, subdivided the land and put each tiny house block on the market for over $500,000. I had also heard that Liliana was a terrible spendthrift. I was showing Reverend Brown from my office when Liliana arrived. She was wearing designer clothes, clutching a designer handbag, and was dripping with diamonds. The Reverend expressed his condolences. Liliana inclined her head. "It was expected, although that doesn't make it any easier." I left them talking and popped back into my office. "Ernie," I called. "Ernie, are you there?" He materialized in front of me. "Ernie, could you please keep an eye out for my mother? I don't want her to disrupt the funeral." Ernie looked aghast.
"She hasn't kicked Jezebel out of her body, has she?"
I shook my head. "Not as far as I know, but I'm worried that she might do just that and then turn up at the funeral." Ernie pulled a face.
"Are you any closer to finding out who killed Jezebel?"
"There are more suspects than there are answers," I told him. "There are the 2 band members, although Lottie seems the more likely, given that she has the motive of Jezebel stealing her boyfriend. I can't really see what motive the other band member, Delilah, would have." Ernie walked over to sit on the edge of my desk.
"What about the boyfriend?"
"He does have a serious gambling problem, and it seems he owes money to the wrong sort of people. Still, I can't see what good killing Jezebel would have done him."
"But she was pressing him to pay the money back,"
Ernie said. I shrugged. "No, it doesn't seem like much of a motive to me. Now this funeral is for Liliana Buckley's father. Liliana is married to Phil Palmer, who I'm quite sure murdered his first wife 5 years ago. He was the one who got Jezebel to falsify the hospital records of his first wife."
"Do you think there's a connection with Jezebel's murder?"
Ernie asked me. "Quite possibly." I rubbed my temples. "And then there's Daisy Fairchild and her husband, Donnie. Daisy paid Jezebel to transfer money from Donnie's account into her account. She's planning to leave him, but she's afraid of him. We saw him with his young, attractive mistress at the charity sale. Daisy told us that Donnie has a terrible temper. Jezebel told me that Donnie threatened her when he found out what she had done. Ernie nodded slowly. I see what you mean. Lottie seems the least likely one to me, but I could see any of the others being the murderer. I agreed. I have to go into the chapel now, but could you please keep an eye out for Jezebel, or Mum, whoever turns up first? The funeral proceeded fairly normally, as funerals usually do. I wondered when I would have the next themed funeral. They were certainly a lot more fun than the standard funerals. I stood at the back of the room, doing my best to look unobtrusive, as funeral directors always did. After a while, I slipped out to the anteroom to make sure everything was in order, that the water was boiling in the urns for tea and coffee, and that the cupcakes and little sandwiches cut into quarters were spread at intervals over the tables. When I slipped back into the chapel by the side door, I was surprised to see Daisy and Donnie Fairchild sitting over the far side of the room. Then again, they were wealthy, as had been Hector Buckley, so I figured that all the wealthy people in town knew each other. What didn't make any sense was that Daisy appeared happy to be with Donnie and was smiling at him. At least there was no sign of Jezebel, or of Mum for that matter. At the close of the service, Reverend Brown invited everyone to go into the anteroom. I walked around the chapel to make sure everything was in order, and then I saw Harper speaking to a group of men. Jezebel walked into the chapel and stood at the back of the room. I hurried over to her. "Mum," I said tentatively. She shook her head slightly.
"Jezebel."
Phew, I've been watching Harper speak to those men. They're all laughing, so he obviously doesn't owe them money.
"Not yet, anyway."
I looked at them again. They all looked like local businessmen, not dodgy moneylenders. I pointed this out to Jezebel and added, "Why is Harper even here?"
"Harper is always looking for someone to play poker with, so he must be here to mingle with the town's wealthy people. He's a fairly good poker player, so he makes money that way. Ouch, what do you do for a hangover?"
I took a long look at Jezebel. Her face was pale and she was hunched over slightly. "How much did you drink?"
"Not that much," she said. "I could always hold my drink before. I could drink anyone under the table."
"But you're in Mum's body," I reminded her. "Mum's never had a drink in her life, which she's told me 1,000,000 times. Jezebel shrugged.
"I figured that, but I thought it would be like a case of multiple personality disorder."
I had no idea what she meant, and I told her so.
"In multiple personality disorder, one personality can have clinical type 2 diabetes, and the other personality can be diabetes-free. That's just one example. Haven't you heard that?"
I shook my head. "I can't say that I have. Anyway, this isn't a case of multiple personality disorder. This is a case of possession." We had walked to the door of the anteroom, and I looked inside. Daisy was laughing with Donnie and patting his arm. I was about to point this out to Jezebel, but she had clearly already seen it.
"Wow, that's a bit suspicious," she said.
"That's what I was thinking. Anyway, I've been doing my best to avoid Donnie, given that I threatened him. I don't think we should go inside." Before I could leave, Daisy caught my eye and walked over in my direction. I ducked back into the chapel behind a huge vase of lilies so Donnie wouldn't see me too. Before Daisy could speak, Jezebel rounded on her.
"You're acting awfully friendly with your husband for someone who's supposed to be so afraid of him."
I shot Jezebel a look to stop her saying any more, but Daisy did not appear to be offended.
"I always have to act friendly with Donnie in public,"
she said, looking over her shoulder.
"If I don't, he goes into a rage."
"You really need to leave that man," I said, "sooner than later at that." Daisy nodded and looked over her shoulder once more. "How well did you know Hector Buckley?" I asked her.
She shrugged. "We always went to the same functions, that sort of thing. We weren't close."
"So you aren't friends with Liliana Buckley or Phil Palmer either?" If Daisy thought my question strange, she showed no signs of it.
No, but I've known them for years too. I thought Liliana and Phil only got married about 4 or 5 years ago. Daisy looked around before speaking. They were having an affair for months before Phil's first wife died. I narrowed my eyes. Yes, the poor thing. Phil's wife was awfully young to die in her sleep, wasn't she? I said in what I hoped was a nonchalant tone. Daisy nodded. Liliana had better be careful now that she's inherited money. She clamped a hand over her mouth. Forget I said that. That was mean-spirited of me. Please tell me what you meant, I said. Daisy's cheeks flushed red. I was just being spiteful, given that I don't like Phil. He's a good friend of my husband's. Jezebel gasped. So that's how Donnie found out that I mean Jezebel, did that hacking work for you? Daisy screwed up her face in confusion, so I hurried to explain. Phil was a hacking client of Jezebel's too. A look of realization passed over Daisy's face. That explains it. I told Jezebel that I didn't confess to Donnie that I'd hired her. Phil must have told Donnie that there was someone in town who could do that sort of thing. She looked back into the anteroom. Well, I'd better get back to Donnie. Jezebel tapped her chin and waited until Daisy was out of earshot before speaking. You know, all this time I thought Daisy really had confessed to Donnie that she'd employed my services as a hacker. Do you think Donnie murdered me? Ernie materialized beside us. Jezebel let out a shriek and I jumped. You scared me, Jezebel said. I'm a ghost. You're a ghost. How could I scare you? Ernie said scornfully. You were supposed to be on watch, I admonished him. You were supposed to tell me if Mum was on her way. Well, she wasn't, was she? I knew it was Jezebel. Anyway, I was listening into your conversation. I think Phil did it. Did what? Jezebel asked him. Ernie shot her a look. Keep up, will you? I think Phil murdered you. How's the investigation going? He addressed that question to me. We've investigated everyone, apart from Delilah Devine, I told him. I suggest you investigate her, simply to exclude her, Ernie said. I don't think she did it. My money's now on Phil. Or maybe Harper, he added as an afterthought. Chapter 14. I'm not sure why we have to speak to Delilah, Jezebel said. I know she didn't do it. What was that? I was annoyed with the driver in front of me. He had been going way under the speed limit when there was no opportunity to overtake, yet as soon as there was an overtaking lane, he sped up. Every time I drew level with him, he hit the accelerator and left me in the dust, so to speak. Jezebel repeated herself. I nodded and resigned myself to staying behind the irritating driver. And I'm sure it isn't Lottie or Harper, Jezebel said for the umpteenth time. Well, somebody had to tell you to go into that alley, I said. Think about it. Someone stole a car for the sole purpose of running over you and killing you. It's highly doubtful that the murderer thought he or she would follow you around until the opportunity presented itself. What are you getting at? Jezebel asked me. Isn't it obvious? The murderer stole the car and was waiting in the alley for you to go outside the club. Did you often go into that alley? No, I don't think I ever did. I shot her a look. Are you sure? Jezebel thought for a moment. Finally, she said, Yes, I'm sure. Then it stands to reason, I said, that whoever murdered you did something to make you go into that alley at that time. I know we've been through this before, but refresh my memory. Who were you at the club with? Lottie and Delilah, Jezebel said. And you're sure no one else you knew was there? Not Harper? Jezebel shook her head. Like you said, we've already been through this, Laurel. Harper wasn't there, and it would have upset Lottie if he had been. No, I'm sure the only people I knew at the club were Lottie and Delilah. My memory is sketchy, but I remember that much. I slammed on the brakes as a lyrebird ran across the road.
Sorry, I said, followed by, wow, you hardly see any of those.
That gave me a fright. Jezebel's hand flew to her throat. I thought it was a kangaroo.
I don't like driving down this road with so much bush either side, I said. You just don't know what's going to run out in front of you. Anyway, are we lost? Jezebel clutched her stomach.
Can you pull over? The winding road's making me feel a bit sick, so I don't want to look down. If you pull over, I can get out and get some fresh air, and then I can look at the map.
I did as she asked, pulling over at the first available place. We were on the edge of the rainforest now, where the tall eucalypts gave way to the magnificent trees of the rainforest. Do you hear the bellbirds? I asked Jezebel. Don't they make the most incredible sound?
I can't see any.
Jezebel looked around her. They're usually very hard to see, I said. They're a very plain brown bird, which is strange because they make the most incredible, clear, tinkling bell-like sound. Anyway, do you know where we're going yet? Jezebel pointed back the way we had come.
Yes, we missed the turn back there. Turn around and head back to Walker.
I sighed. Are we completely lost?
It depends what you mean by completely, Jezebel said.
After taking the scenic route, we ended up back on the outskirts of Walker. Are you sure Mum hasn't taken over your body again? I asked Jezebel.
No, why would you say that?
Because you share the same navigating ability, or lack thereof. You took us at least an hour and a half out of our way. I stopped in the main street of Walker and managed to do a reverse angle park despite several angry motorists lined up behind me. They apparently thought cars could magically reverse into a 45-degree angle parking spot without blocking their way for a few moments.
It's not my fault that Delilah wanted to meet us at a cafe instead of at her home, Jezebel complained. I know where she lives.
I got out of the car and looked at her over the roof. Didn't it occur to you that a cafe would be in town, not out in the middle of nowhere? Jezebel crossed her arms over her chest.
Ginger's Creek Cafe is out in the middle of nowhere. I thought this cafe might be too.
I had to admit she had a point. Well, let's go inside. Delilah sent a rather terse text when I told her we were lost. As an afterthought, I added, Do your best not to let Mum come out, won't you? That could be a terrible disaster. I looked at Jezebel and then did a double take. Are you crying? Jezebel hastily wiped her eyes.
No, she said gruffly.
What's wrong? I asked her.
How about being dead for a start? Not knowing who murdered you and being in your mother, of all people.
Oh, that. My heart went out to her. I would hate to be in her shoes. I spied Delilah immediately. In a room of people sensibly dressed, as my mother would say, she stood out like a sore thumb. She was wearing a tight-fitting vinyl bodice top from which a sea-blue tutu emerged. Her black, fingerless gloves were topped by bracelet after bracelet. The farmers in the room could not take their eyes off her. Delilah afforded us a thin-lipped smile when we approached her table. I noticed an empty coffee cup and an empty plate in front of her. I'm so terribly sorry we're late, I said over the noise of the crowded cafe. Mum is not the best navigator.
So it seems,
Delilah said through pursed lips.
I'm not sure why you wanted to meet me.
Jezebel and I had already decided what to say. While we had convinced Harper that Mum and Jezebel were old friends, Jezebel said that would never work on Delilah. To our advantage was the fact that Delilah and Harper disliked each other intensely, so they were hardly likely to compare notes. Jezebel had advised me to tell Delilah the truth, or as close to the truth as possible. I don't usually get involved in murder cases when I'm the funeral director for murder victims, I said. Okay, so I wasn't starting with the truth after all. However, in this case, I don't think the police have a clue. I was wondering if you could answer a few questions about what happened the night that Jezebel was murdered.
Why do you want to get involved? She asked me. What's it to you?
It's my mother, I said, nodding to Jezebel. She's terribly upset that the murder hasn't been solved. She lives right next to the funeral home, you see, and she's distraught that we buried a murder victim whose murder might never be solved. Jezebel nodded.
I haven't been able to sleep at all, and it's affecting my health. I've already had an overnight stay in hospital over it.
Delilah appeared to be thinking it over.
I suppose I can answer some questions. After all, I'm here anyway. I come to this place now and then to buy those candles.
She gestured to a well-known brand of scented candles, my favourite, actually. I could smell the fragrance of the coffee and vanilla ones. I thanked her. Do you have any idea who could have murdered Jezebel? Delilah shook her head.
Of course not. If I had, I would have told the police.
Do you know why Jezebel went into the alley that night? I asked her.
I already told the police all about that, Delilah said.
Would you mind repeating it to us? I asked her. Sorry, I know it's a terrible bother, but it would make my mother feel better. Delilah looked from me to Jezebel and then back to me.
The three of us were drinking, and then Jezebel said she had to go outside. She said she'd be back in 5 minutes. Did she go out with anyone else? Jezebel asked her, or was she alone?
Delilah looked at her watch and fidgeted.
She was alone?
I was about to ask something else when she added, she went out just after she had a phone call. You know who it was from? I asked her. Delilah shook her head.
That was it. The call came on the club phone. She was surprised that someone would call her on the club phone, and when she came back, that's when she said she had to go straight outside.
I bit my lip. Do you have any suspicions at all as to who it could have been?
At first I thought she was giving Harper more money, but then she wouldn't need to do that furtively. Lottie and I knew she gave Harper money all the time. It made Lottie really angry because she thought that was the only reason Harper wanted to date Jezebel rather than her.
She waved one hand in dismissal.
Anyway, I'm not getting into all that.
Delilah stood up.
I hope that was some help to you.
I thanked her and apologised once more for being so late. Delilah nodded, but before she left the table, she turned back to me.
One more thing. It's probably nothing, but it's the first thing I thought of when I heard Jezebel had been murdered.
What was that? I asked her.
I thought Harper had asked her to pay off the people he owed money to, and she didn't have all the money, so they murdered her as a warning to Harper.
She shrugged.
Anyway, I told the police.
With that, she nodded to us and then left the cafe in a hurry. Jezebel raised her eyebrows at me.
What do you think of that?
I think it's time for coffee and cake, I said, as a waitress approached our table. As soon as the waitress left with our orders, I said, if she was right about you being murdered as a warning to Harper, surely the police would be all over it. Jezebel did not seem to share my opinion.
I don't know. It does kind of make sense.
Is it jogging any memories? Jezebel stared off into the distance, clearly thinking it over, but then I heard a loud hymn.
Who's playing church music around here?
Jezebel asked me. It's Mum's ringtone, I told her. Don't answer it. Jezebel pulled the phone out of her handbag and slid it across the table to me. It's Ian, I said. He rang 5 more times, which was irritating, but there was no way I would let Jezebel answer it. Just then my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, so I answered it with a tentative, "Hello?"
"Laurel?"
said a female voice. I answered in the affirmative.
"Oh, thank goodness it's you. It's Audrey. I wasn't sure this was your number, but I found it on my phone records from when you called the other night. There's a problem with Ian. Ever since he drank that non-alcoholic wine the other night, he's had a speech impediment."
I knew that she had said non-alcoholic for the benefit of Ian, so I realised he was listening to her call. "A speech impediment," I said. "Oh, well, he did drink an awful lot, and he's probably never had a drink before."
"That's for sure," Audrey said. "Anyway, I've been unable to placate him, so he wants to speak to your mother.
He just tried to call her several times. Perhaps her phone was turned off, I lied. She's right here. I'll put her on. Jezebel glared at me, but I simply shrugged. The phone was on loud, so I could hear everything.
Thelma, if that you, I'm possessed by the spirit of improper speech.
Jezebel and I exchanged glances.
I'm sorry, Ian. What did you say? She asked him.
Ian sobbed a little before answering.
It's my speech. I can't speak properly. I'm sorry to call you, but Pastor Green isn't answering his phone, so I can't speak to him.
I took the phone from Jezebel and spoke to Ian. Ian, could I speak to Audrey, please?
Yes, sure, he said. Here she is.
When Audrey answered, I said, Did he somehow find out the wine was alcoholic? I'm afraid so, she said. He felt quite sick, so he went to the doctor, who told him he had a hangover. Ian insisted to the doctor it was non-alcoholic wine, but the doctor told him there must have been a labelling mix-up. I think he's having some sort of reaction to the thought of drinking alcohol. I agreed with her. I'm so sorry about that. Ian spoke again.
Yes, the labels were mixed up, so that's why the Jezebel spirit got into Thelma. She was drinking the alcoholic one, thinking it was non-alcoholic.
I clutched my sides and did my best not to burst into a fit of giggles. Chapter 15. I hadn't slept well the night before. I was worried because no one suspect was coming to the fore. Several people appeared to have a motive. It was doing my head in. I showered, dressed, and then headed to my coffee machine. I drank 1 cup of coffee quickly and then made a second. I took it downstairs into my office, wanting to see where I was up to with the bookings. So much had been going on lately that I didn't want to let things get out of hand with my work. A quick look through my appointments reassured me. Everything seemed under control after all. I jumped with fright when the doorbell sounded. To my delight, it was Basil, but he didn't waste any time. He kissed me soundly, thrust a newspaper at me, jabbed his finger at one of the pages, and then left, saying he was running late. After he left, I took the newspaper to my office. A small article in the middle of the paper said that Liliana was the sole heir to a multi-million-dollar inheritance. I jumped to my feet, snatched up the newspaper, and hurried over to Mum's house. Mum, or Jezebel, answered the door as soon as I knocked.
Come in,
she said, standing aside. I didn't know which one it was, so I said, Thanks, and followed her in.
Why are you acting weird?
She asked me. I then realized that she was Jezebel. Jezebel, I didn't know if it was you or Mum, so next time could you say, It's me, Jezebel? Jezebel laughed.
Sure. What are you doing with that newspaper?
I handed it to her and then walked into the living room and sat on a chair. Jezebel followed me in. She handed the newspaper back to me before likewise taking a seat.
It says Liliana inherited millions, but didn't we already know that?
I shook my head. I thought perhaps $1 million or so, but not multi-millions of dollars, and it says she's the sole heir, so she gets everything. For all I knew, she had 5 or so brothers or sisters. Jezebel bit one fingernail.
I'm not sure where you're going with this.
I'm surprised they had such a cheap funeral. Jezebel snorted.
Is that it? You think they should have spent more money on her father's funeral?
I don't know. Something's worrying me about this. Okay, hear me out. Jezebel waved me on. I took a deep breath. Phil married Liliana not long after his first wife died. Liliana was the heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune. We know he killed his first wife. What if he murdered her to get her out of the way so he could marry Liliana? Jezebel stood up, stretched, and then sat back down again.
Couldn't he have simply divorced her? Divorce would be much easier than murder.
True. I actually hadn't thought of that. So we know he murdered her, but we don't know his motive. Anyway, I hadn't got to my point. Let's just say he murdered his first wife so he could marry Liliana. And what if he's intending to murder Liliana so he can get all her money? Jezebel clasped her hands.
It makes sense. I see where you're going with this, Laurel. With 2 murdered wives on his hands, of course the police would look closely at his first wife's murder. Since the hospital records now state that she suffered from sleep apnea, her death won't look too suspicious to them.
Yet if the hospital records didn't state that, I said, it would look awfully suspicious. I figure he murdered you because you were the one loose end he had to tie up. Jezebel walked into the kitchen, and I followed her. She made herself a cup of tea.
Tea? Is that really you, Jezebel? Don't panic, Laurel, it's me. Your mother's body can't handle too much coffee.
I held up a hand. No details, please.
I am puzzled by one thing, she said. Why would he have to murder Liliana? Couldn't he just live off her millions?
I shrugged. I've heard she's a terrible spendthrift. She'll probably go through that money in no time. I think we need to look more closely at his first wife. That should give us the answer. Jezebel let out a shriek.
Please tell me you're not going to drag me back to see that weird old doctor with his ferrets.
I laughed. No, I thought we'd consult Dr. Google. Let's go back to my office and see if we can find anything.
But I wanted to watch Days of Our Lives, Jezebel said. I recorded yesterday's episode.
Is that you, Mum? I said, horrified. Jezebel was clearly offended.
Well, there's no need to make fun of me. I was bored here, so I watched it once or twice, and then I got hooked. Besides, haven't we already tried to find information on this first wife's death?
Yes, we looked for information on her death, but now I'm saying that we should look for information on her. Maybe we can find something out about her that gives us a clue. Jezebel narrowed her eyes.
Like what?
No idea, but we won't find it by standing around here talking. Soon we were back in my office, looking through newspaper articles online. Ernie was helping us, although I used the term loosely. He leant over me and pointed to the computer screen at intervals.
Look at that, he said. There she is. That photo of her at the National Wool Week fashion show with those 2 other women. See, their names are on the bottom.
He pointed at the screen a little too closely, and his finger went right through it. I had already seen the information for myself, but I thanked him anyway. Have you found anything, Jezebel? She shook her head.
And if anyone is going to find something, it would be me. Tell me the names of those women, and I'll see what I can find on them. If they're still in town, we can go and see them and give them the 3rd degree.
Leanne Fitzroy and Janice Piper, I said. They both looked quite elderly in the photo. I tapped away at the keys for another half hour or so, all the while Ernie leaning over my shoulder, but couldn't find anything. Jezebel, on the other hand, came up trumps.
Janice Piper passed away, she said, and Leanne Fitzroy is in an aged care facility.
Please tell me she's at the one in town, I said. Jezebel looked mighty pleased with herself.
As a matter of fact, she is. She lived in France for a few years with her son's family, and then they all came back to town. Last year she moved to the aged care facility.
I thought it over for a few minutes. Can anyone just walk in off the street and visit people in aged care facilities? Jezebel stood up.
Come on, there's no time like the present. We'll just say we're friends of an old friend of hers, and if they won't let us see her, then I'll just hack into their records and turn us into her nieces. If that happens, we'd have to make sure we went there when there was a different receptionist on duty, of course.
It seemed like a plan. It was the only one we had. The aged care facility looked like a blue brick house from the outside, but when we drove down what seemed like a driveway beside the house, it opened onto a large facility which looked pleasant enough. To my relief, the receptionist simply asked us to sign a book and told us that Leanne was either watching TV with the other residents or was sitting in the rose garden at the back of the facility.
That was easy,
Jezebel whispered in my ear. It didn't prove to be so easy finding Leanne because she wasn't sitting with the other residents. As we didn't know what she looked like, having only seen one old, grainy photo, we had to ask several people. No one had seen her for a while, so we walked to the rose garden at the back of the facility. There, sitting on a wooden bench that was built into the concrete wall, was an elderly lady. She looked frail, except for the fact she was knitting at what seemed to me like an impossible speed. On the way over, Jezebel and I had decided to level with her. After all, we couldn't think of anything better. "Hello, Leanne Fitzroy?" I asked her. She looked surprised and nodded. "I'm Laurel, and this is my mother, Thelma." She looked at us with shrewd eyes.
"Do I know you? I'm not going to your church."
I suppressed a chuckle. Mum must have had that look about her, even when she was possessed by a punk rocker. "I don't go to church," I said. "I hope you don't mind us visiting you, but a woman was murdered recently, and we think you might have some information that could possibly help." I had expected her to look dismayed, but she clapped her hands with delight.
"What fun! I can't see that I can be any help to you, but please tell me all about it."
Jezebel had agreed to let me do all the talking, but she disregarded that and launched right into it.
"A woman was murdered recently, not long after Phil Palmer asked her to falsify his first wife's hospital records. He asked her to change the records to reflect that his wife had sleep apnea."
Leanne stopped knitting.
Julia Palmer?"
I nodded. "Yes, that's right. We suspect that Phil Palmer murdered Julia. He didn't want anyone to look into her death, so he paid the recently murdered woman to hack into the hospital records to state that Julia had sleep apnea."
"Julia didn't have sleep apnea," Leanne said. "You know, I always thought Phil had done away with her. Are you two police officers?"
"No," Jezebel and I said in unison. "We're good friends of the murdered woman," I added. Leanne stuck her knitting needles through a ball of wool and set it beside her on the seat.
"That's always bothered me. Although Julia was many years younger, we were firm friends. It was strange how she died, and Phil had her cremated. I thought that was suspicious, as Julia always said she didn't want to be cremated."
Jezebel and I exchanged glances. Leanne was still talking.
"I even went to the police, but they just thought I was a silly old woman."
"So you actually thought he murdered Julia?" Jezebel asked her.
Leanne nodded. "Phil was always money hungry, and Julia refused to divorce him."
"Why?" I asked her.
"She was madly in love with him, sad to say. She would have done anything for him. When they married, she was quite a wealthy woman. He went through all her money, but she still didn't see the light."
"One thing's been puzzling us," I said. "If he wanted to get rid of Julia, why didn't he simply divorce her? He didn't need her consent to divorce her." Leanne shook her head.
"It's awfully sad, really. Julia was quite obsessed with Phil. She knew he had embezzled money from his previous employer, so she blackmailed him to stay with her. She suspected he was having affairs, but that only made her more obsessed with him."
Jezebel nodded slowly.
"So by killing his wife, not only did Phil do away with the blackmail, but it left him free to marry the wealthy socialite, Liliana, as he was already having an affair with her." "I like it here," Leanne said. "I have my own room with an ensuite bathroom, and I even have my little dog."
For the first time, I noticed a shaggy, little white dog sitting under a rose bush. He was fast asleep.
"The one thing that's worried me," Leanne continued, "is Julia's death. There was no reason for her to die, a young woman like that."
She reached out a frail hand for mine.
"Dear, promise me you'll call me and let me know if you find out anything."
Chapter 16. Jezebel and I were sitting in my office at the funeral home with Ernie.
"So you're pretty sure that's what happened?"
Ernie asked us. We both nodded.
"He wanted me to hack into the hospital records and falsify them 5 years after Julia died," Jezebel said. "The death was considered to be of natural causes at the time, so why would he want the records falsified 5 years later?"
"So we have to consider the possibility that Phil might be about to murder Liliana, and he doesn't want 2 suspicious deaths in a row," I added.
"Do you think it's a good idea to invite Liliana here?" Ernie said. "How can you break it to her gently? Are you going to come straight out and tell her that her husband might be trying to kill her to get her money and that he murdered his first wife?"
There was no chance to answer because the doorbell rang. Anxiety suddenly overcame me, and I took several deep breaths to try to calm myself. I showed Liliana straight into the office, and she nodded to Jezebel.
"Why the mystery? What did you want to see me about? You said there wasn't a problem with the account for my father's funeral."
"No, nothing like that." I gestured to a comfortable chair opposite my desk. As soon as she was seated, I continued. "There's no easy way to say this, so please forgive me for being forthright. I hope I'm wrong, but I just have to come straight out and tell you what we believe to be the case." Liliana frowned but said nothing. I let out a deep breath and then launched straight into it. "Please forgive me for saying so, but we think your husband might have been involved in a recent murder." Liliana gasped but did not speak, so I pushed on. "The victim was a close friend of ours, which is why we're involved. Your husband was a client of the victim's, and he recently asked her to hack into the hospital records and falsify them to say that his first wife suffered from sleep apnea." Liliana finally found her voice.
"Surely you don't think my husband murdered her? Is that what you're saying? That my husband murdered someone?"
She snatched up her handbag and stood up.
"Are you accusing my husband of murder?"
Her voice was shrill.
"So much for breaking it to her gently," Ernie said with a laugh.
"Shut up," Jezebel said to Ernie. "You're no help. This is serious."
Liliana, of course, thought Jezebel was talking to her. She sat down and clutched her handbag to her. I was surprised, although relieved by Liliana's reaction, so nodded to Jezebel to continue.
"We only have your interests at heart," Jezebel said. "It seems obvious to us that your husband murdered his first wife, Julia. She knew he was having affairs, but she was in love with him, so she refused to let him divorce her."
Liliana made to protest, but Jezebel held up a hand to forestall her.
"Julia knew about Phil's embezzlement, so threatened to make that public if he divorced her. Basically, she blackmailed him into staying married to her."
Liliana turned white.
"Phil had Julia cremated, we think, to cover up the fact that he murdered her. Even if you don't want to believe that, it's a cold, hard fact that he asked the recently murdered woman to hack into the hospital records. Why else would he do that?"
Liliana finally spoke. "What are you trying to say?" "There's no easy way to say this," I began, but Jezebel interrupted me.
"We think he's about to murder you," Jezebel said, coming straight to the point. "Of course, we could be wrong, but why would he want hospital records changed 5 years after his wife's death? The only thing that makes sense is that he's about to murder you and doesn't want the police to look too closely into his first wife's murder. You have to admit the timing is strange. Your father died recently from a long-term illness, so Phil was preparing to murder you."
"Geez, how many times can you say the word murder all at once?" Ernie said. "I think she's going to faint or something."
I had to agree with him. "I'll get you a glass of water," I said, then hurried out of the room. When I returned, I was surprised to see that Liliana was babbling away.
"Our marriage isn't happy,"
she was saying as I walked in the room. I didn't know what she had said before I got there, but Jezebel filled me in.
"Liliana said someone's been following her, and she felt that she was in danger."
I handed Liliana the glass of water, but she only took a sip. To my dismay, she burst into tears. I handed her a box of tissues. She took one and then blew her nose.
"Our marriage isn't happy," she said again. "Tell Laurel what you told me," Jezebel said.
Liliana nodded.
"We've had 2 burglaries in the last month, and I know someone has been following me. Phil insisted I call the police. Only the other week, I was being followed as usual, so I ducked into a shop to get a close look at who was following me. It was Phil. I ran out and asked why he was following me, and he said he was trying to catch the person who was following me."
"And you believed him?" Jezebel asked her.
"Yes, of course I did," she said. "Why wouldn't I? Now that I have the benefit of hindsight, I'm starting to think he might have been the one following me all the time."
Ernie jumped up and down.
"It's obvious, isn't it? Phil's going to murder her, and the police will have it on record that someone's been following her, so they won't suspect him."
"That's right," Jezebel said to Ernie. Liliana looked up at Jezebel. "You think Phil was following me?" "At the risk of upsetting you," I said, "I think Phil has bad intentions towards you. There is now a strong police record that you're being followed, so when something bad happens to you, the police won't suspect Phil."
"And if police look into the death of his first wife, they'll see the falsified records
that she had sleep apnea, so they won't be suspicious," Jezebel said. "It all adds up."
Liliana burst into tears. Chapter 17.
"Why do you mortals eat so much chocolate when you're stressed?"
Ernie said. Jezebel and I ignored him. We were in the funeral home kitchen stuffing our faces full of chocolate. A tearful Liliana had promised to go straight to the police. She had also promised us that she would stay with a friend in another town and not return to her house. I had texted Basil to bring him up to speed. "The police will come here and ask us how we knew about the hacking," I pointed out to Jezebel. She slapped her forehead.
"I didn't even think of that. What will we say?"
"I've thought about that. We'll tell them that you, that is Mum, saw her in the street a few weeks ago and wanted her to repent and go to your, that is Mum's, church."
"Stop," Jezebel said. "You're confusing me."
"Put it this way. I'll tell the detectives that Mum saw you walking along the street a few weeks ago and took you into a cafe to try to force you to repent and go to her church. You told her about the hacking." Jezebel shook her head.
"That's way too far-fetched. The detectives will never believe that."
I laughed ruefully. "Trust me, those detectives have had a big run-in with Mum before. They'll believe anything when it comes to her."
"That's for sure,"
Ernie said. He stopped talking for a moment.
"Did you hear that?"
"What?" I asked him, but he had vanished. I popped another chocolate in my mouth. I had only just swallowed it when Ernie appeared.
"Get out of here. There's someone out there sneaking in this direction."
I grabbed Jezebel's arm and hurried to the kitchen door, but just as my hand reached for it, Phil burst in. He was clutching a large hunting knife. "You figured it out, didn't you?"
"Figured out what?"
Jezebel squeaked. "I happened to run into Dr. Sharp today, and he told me you were there asking questions about Julia's death." He advanced on us. Jezebel and I clung to each other and backed away. "Yes, we did, and we've told the police already," I said. "You got Jezebel to hack into the hospital computers and change your wife's details to say she had sleep apnea, and you made sure she was cremated. You intend to murder your current wife, which is why you've been following her and making her report it to the police." Phil laughed maniacally, and I realized how unhinged he actually was. "Yes, it's a good plan, actually. I encouraged Liliana to tell the police she was being followed, and I made it look like we had break-ins. And do you think I'm stupid? I know you haven't told the police because they haven't questioned me. In fact, I'll dispose of you two and then go straight home to dispose of Liliana. and then a couple of other random people as well, just to cover my tracks. I couldn't believe he was serious. The room spun, and I clutched onto Jezebel. It certainly wouldn't do to faint at a moment like this, but I was overcome with dizziness.
"He's a homicidal maniac," Ernie said. "Quick, your only hope is to distract him."
"How?"
Jezebel said. Phil paused for a moment, seemingly taken aback by Jezebel's question. "What do you mean?"
"Do you believe in ghosts?"
Jezebel asked him. Phil snorted rudely. "You're about to become one."
"I already am," Jezebel said. "I'm Jezebel. I possessed Laurel's mother so I could solve my murder."
Phil was struck speechless.
"Ask me anything," Jezebel said. "Ask me anything that only the two of us would know. After all, we did have that one-night stand."
Despite the situation, I rounded on her. "Jezebel, you didn't tell me that. Don't you think that was important information?" She shook her head.
"I was embarrassed about sleeping with this loser."
Phil laughed. "Entertaining, ladies, but it won't save you. Nothing personal. If you hadn't been such busybodies, this wouldn't have happened to you."
"I am Jezebel," she said.
Phil lunged at her by way of response, but quick as a flash, Jezebel ripped off her top.
"Get a look at this."
At that precise moment, the kitchen door opened. It was Ian. He let out a blood-curdling scream. Chapter 18. Phil dropped the knife and ran. Ian slid to the floor. He sobbed softly and whimpered at intervals. "I can never unsee that. I can never unsee that." Again and again. In good news, at least he could pronounce S again.
"Are you all right?"
Jezebel asked me as she put her top back on. I nodded. "I'm all right, but the same can't be said for Ian." Just then I heard loud yelling. I ran out with Jezebel directly behind me. In the foyer, Detective Prescott and Detective Wilkinson were handcuffing a struggling Phil. "Are you ladies all right?" Prescott asked us. "Liliana Buckley just came to see us." "He told us he was going to kill us," I said to the detectives. "He confessed everything. He told us he paid Jezebel to hack into the hospital records to state that his first wife had sleep apnea, and he told us that he'd killed his first wife. He was going to kill Liliana. He said he'd been following her and faked break-ins so you wouldn't be suspicious when he murdered her, too. He wanted her money."
"That's right," Jezebel said. "He came at us with a knife, but Ian arrived and screamed. That startled Phil, so he ran out."
"It was that old lady who scared me," Phil said, nodding at Jezebel and shuddering. "The old lady flashed at me. She has a familiar tattoo. I've seen it somewhere before."
"How dare you call me old, young man?" she said. "And what does flash mean? Whatever it means, I didn't do it."
"Good work, Jezebel," I whispered in her ear. "You sounded just like Mum then."
"Whatever's gotten into you, Laurel?" Mum said. "Actually, I don't feel very well."
I looked up to see Jezebel's ghost standing next to Mum. "You could have given me some warning," I said, and she shrugged.
"You silly girl. How could I give you a warning that I didn't feel well? Sometimes I wonder about you, Laurel. Have I ever told you that you took 3 days to be born?"
I sighed long and hard. I liked Mum much better when she was possessed by Jezebel. Chapter 19. Basil, Ernie and I were in Mum's kitchen. I had disposed of the remaining wine bottles and any other evidence of Jezebel's stay. Basil had arrived just after the detectives, and Mum had called Pastor Green because she was concerned about Ian. Ian said he had been hallucinating and had seen the most terrible sight. When Pastor Green had pressed him about it, he had burst into tears and said it was too horrible to talk about.
"I'm very sad,"
Ernie said, as I busied myself making a cup of tea for everyone.
I think I'm going to be bored again, just when I was getting some colour in my otherwise dull life. Oh well, given the funeral home's track record, there will probably be another murder soon.
Basil put his arm around me protectively. I certainly hope not. You've had a few close shaves, Laurel, but this was a little too close for comfort. I didn't know what to say, so I simply carried out the teapot and the teacups on a tray. I placed them on the coffee table in the living room. Pastor Green was sitting next to Mum, patting her hand. Ian was sitting on an adjoining comfortable armchair, right under a framed, embroidered tapestry that featured a ring of pansies and the Bible verse, Samaria shall become desolate, for she hath rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up. Hosea chapter 13, verse 16. Pastor Green followed my gaze. Oh, is that a new tapestry, Thelma? She nodded cheerfully.
Yes, I like to have the Word of God all around my walls. It's so uplifting, isn't it?
Pastor Green frowned and then said, I'm glad to see you're back to yourself, Thelma. You haven't been yourself for the last few days. Mum, can you remember much about the last few days? I asked her. It would be quite bothersome if she could remember being possessed by a punk rocker. Mum's eyes shifted from side to side.
No, it's a bit of a blur, really. Perhaps I had one of my migraines.
Pastor Green patted her hand once more. I think your medication was mixed up. Mum looked aghast.
I'm not on any medication. At least I don't think so.
She fanned herself with a religious pamphlet.
Laurel, please entertain Pastor Green and Ian. I can't explain it, but I feel the need to have a shower.
Sure, I said. I was just pouring Pastor Green another cup of tea when a blood-curdling scream all but shook the house. Pastor Green dropped his fork into his cake. What was that? He asked in alarm. It's nothing to worry about, I said. When Mum was under the influence of the wrong medication, she got a tattoo. Now that Mum's back to normal, I'd say she's just discovered the tattoo. Ian burst into tears. I wasn't hallucinating after all, he said between his sobs. Things will never be the same. He clamped his hands firmly over his eyes and continued to sob. Basil stood up. Pastor Green, would you mind looking after Thelma and Ian? Laurel has been under a lot of strain lately, and I want to whisk her away. Pastor Green looked horrified. I mean, who could blame him? But agreed. Ian folded up into the fetal position and continued to sob. Mum appeared in the living room doorway. She looked quite a fright in her faded tartan bathrobe and staid slippers. Her face was red and shining, no doubt having been scrubbed with sensible soap, and her shaved head was gleaming under the fluorescent light. I had forgotten about her hairstyle.
Fornication, she exclaimed. Basil, you want to whisk Laurel away, as you put it, to your place to fornicate, without the benefit of marriage.
Trust Mum to have those priorities. She had just discovered that she had a large tattoo of a flaming skull on a part of her that no doubt only God would ever see again, and had just discovered she was sporting a mohawk hairstyle. Yet for all that, she wanted to complain about my morals. Yes, Basil said, that's exactly what we intend to do. Fornicate all night. With that, we took our leave. Although I was a little disappointed that Jezebel no longer possessed Mum, I was glad that my world was back to normal. There was a sense of security in that. The end. The next audiobook in this series is Repossessed. What's worse than being possessed? Repossessed. Laurel thought seeing her mother possessed was bad, but she finds it hard to keep up her spirits when Thelma is struck by lightning and possesses a man with a less than wholesome reputation. There will be grave consequences when Thelma, who is not in her own body, is the main suspect in a murder, and Ian does some sleuthing. Will Thelma give up the ghost, or will Laurel be able to make everything right? It's a dead certainty that this is the new paranormal. Repossessed is book 6 in this USA Today best-selling series. You can find this and other audiobooks by Morgana Best exclusively at morganabest.com. You've just listened to Ghost Blusters, Book 5 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Text copyright 2020 by Morgana Best. Audio production copyright 2023 by Morgana Best. If you've enjoyed this audiobook, please consider leaving a review and recommending on social media or directly to friends and family. And you can find other audiobooks by Morgana Best exclusively at morganabest.com. Thanks for listening.